Welcome back. Hey, my dear friends. I'm really glad you're here tonight. Get comfortable. Find your favorite spot. Maybe pull that blanket a little closer, because tonight we're going somewhere you've never been before. And I promise you, you'll never look at a clean sidewalk the same way again. Imagine waking up one morning, and before you even open your eyes, the smell hits you. Not coffee, not rain on fresh pavement, nothing you'd recognize as pleasant. It's something thick, something ancient, something so deeply, profoundly wrong that your whole body tenses up before your brain even has a chance to explain what's happening. Now, imagine that smell isn't coming from a dumpster outside. It's coming from everywhere: the streets, the river, the walls of your house, the air your children breathe. And the most terrifying part: nobody around you thinks this is unusual, because to them, this is just Tuesday. Welcome to the greatest city in medieval Europe, a place of kings, cathedrals, merchants, poets, and roughly 900,000 liters of human excrement produced every single year. Tonight, we're going to follow the true story of one city's long, slow, spectacular war with its own filth. A war that took centuries to even begin and a single unbearable summer to finally win. This is the story of London, but really, it's the story of every city that ever had to figure out what to do when too many people, too much ambition, and absolutely zero sewage planning end up in the same place at the same time. Before we go any further, though, if this is your first time finding this channel, I just want to say, welcome home. And if you've been here before, you already know what we do here. We slow down, we listen, we let history breathe. If tonight's story moves something in you, if it makes you curious or a little uneasy or even just grateful for modern plumbing, go ahead and hit that like button. Subscribe if you want more nights like this one. Leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight. I genuinely love reading those. Is it midnight on your couch? A Sunday afternoon with tea? A long road trip where the kids finally fell asleep? And hey, if you've got a friend who loves history or a partner who can never fall asleep, share this with them. The more, the merrier. This kind of story deserves a good audience. Now, dim those lights if you can. Let the world outside go. Quiet for a little while. Tonight's journey starts right now. Let's set the scene. The year is 1348. The city of London has somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 people crammed inside its ancient Roman walls, which, by the way, were never designed to hold that many. The streets are narrow. I mean really narrow. Some of them just wide enough for two people to pass each other sideways, which they often had to do, while also dodging the horse, the pig, and the small mountain of something unidentifiable in the middle of the road. Now, here's something I want you to really picture, because this detail changed everything for me the first time I came across it. A historian and professor named Dolly Jorgensen once calculated what a medieval city of just 10,000 people produced in terms of human waste every single year. Just 10,000 people. The number she arrived at was 900,000 liters of excrement and nearly 3 million liters of urine every single year. And London didn't have 10,000 people. London had somewhere between 8 and 10 times that number. Now, there were no underground sewers, no waste treatment facilities, no public restrooms with little motion sensor hand dryers. There were holes dug in, the ground called cesspits. There were wooden platforms called latrines hanging over rivers, and there was the street. And when the cesspits got full, which they did constantly guess where everything went. You already know the answer. But here is the part I find genuinely fascinating, not just disgusting. Medieval Londoners were not stupid. They were not lazy. They were not somehow less intelligent than we are today. In fact, the city had laws, real written, enforceable laws about waste disposal. Householders were legally required to clean the street in front of their own homes. There were city employees called rakers and scavengers, yes. That was their actual job title, whose entire purpose was to collect the filth that piled up on the streets and haul it outside the city walls. There were ordinances about where you could dump waste, when you could dump it, and how far it needed to be from a neighbor's property. And yet, the streets were still ankle-deep in what one historian described as a putrid mix of wet mud, rotten fish, garbage, entrails, and animal dung. How is that possible? Because here's the math problem, that London and every other growing medieval city simply could not so. LVE. The rules existed for a city of a certain size, but the city kept growing faster than anyone could have imagined. The population wasn't just adding people, it was multiplying them, cramming them into smaller and smaller spaces, filling every available courtyard and alleyway with new tenements and workshops and slaughterhouses. The rules stayed the same. The enforcement stayed the same, but the sheer volume of everything people, animals, waste, noise, disease just kept expanding. And at some point, the gap between what the rules could handle and what the city actually produced became impossible to bridge. This isn't just a medieval problem, by the way, but we'll come back to that. Now, let's talk about the animals, because I think people often forget this part. When we picture a medieval city, we imagine people, merchants and monks and knights and peasants. But London in the 1300s was also full of animals. Not at a farm somewhere on the edge of town, right there, in the streets, in the marketplaces, in the courtyards, beside your bedroom window. Pigs, cattle, horses, goats, geese, chickens. Horses alone, which were the primary form of transport for anyone who could afford one, produced somewhere between 15 and 35 pounds of manure per day, and London had thousands of horses. In 1371, King Edward III sent a formal complaint to the mayor and aldermen of London specifically about the butchers of the city. The complaint stated that the constant disposal of animal waste bones, hides, entrails of oxen, pigs, and sheep were being dumped directly into the rivers and streets, and that it was, and I'm paraphrasing here, corrupting the water and infecting the air. A royal complaint to the mayor about the city smelling like a slaughterhouse. And this is the king. The man who lived in a palace. The man who could afford to be as far from the smell as anyone in England. Even he couldn't escape it. Here's a detail I personally find equal parts horrifying and oddly poetic. By the early 1400s, roughly 60 years after that royal complaint, the streets of medieval Paris had gotten so consistently coated in filth that city administrators started naming streets after it. Not metaphorically, literally. There was a street called Rue Merdieu, another called Rue de la Merderie, Rue Merderate, Rue Merdière, and my personal favorite, a street simply called Rue du Pipi. These were real street, names on real maps in the capital of what was then the most powerful kingdom in Europe. Think about that for a second. Somewhere in medieval Paris, a city official sat down, dipped his quill in ink, and wrote the words, Street of the P, on an official city document, and then filed it away. Nobody objected, because it was accurate. Now, I want to be honest with you about something because I think it matters. It's very easy to sit here in the 21st century and shake our heads and laugh at how dirty medieval cities were. And I understand that impulse, I really do. But there's a more interesting question hiding underneath all of this. The question isn't why were medieval cities so dirty? The question is, why did it take so long for anyone to fix it? Because people knew. They could see the filth. They could smell it. Obviously, there were laws trying to address it. There were workers being paid to manage it. There were kings writing angry letters about it. And still, for generation after generation, nothing fundamentally changed. And the answer to that question turns out to be one of the most important lessons in all of urban history. It wasn't ignorance. It wasn't laziness. It wasn't ever a lack of resources. It was scale. Every solution that existed had been designed for a smaller city. And by the time anyone recognized that the city had outgrown its infrastructure, not just its sewage infrastructure, but its water infrastructure, its street infrastructure, its everything, the problem had already become so enormous, so deeply baked into the physical fabric of the city, that fixing it would require not just a new system, but an entirely new way of thinking about what the city even was. And that realization would take until the summer of 1858, a summer so hot, so foul, so utterly unbearable that it would drive the most powerful government in the world out of its own buildings. A summer that would finally force an answer to a question the city had been avoiding for 500 years. But before we get to that summer, and trust me, we are going to get there, and it is going to be extraordinary. We need to understand something important. We need to understand how civilizations can move forward and backward at the same time. How a city can forget completely, systematically, catastrophically forget knowledge that was perfectly well understood 1,000 years earlier. Because while London was drowning in its own waste in the 30s, there had once been a city, right here on this same planet, built 2,000 years before medieval London, that had already solved every single one of these problems. A city with underground sewers, with running water in homes, with public baths that held thousands of people at a time, with a drainage system so well engineered that parts of it are still functioning today. That city was Rome. And what happened to all of that knowledge? That's exactly where we're going next. So, we ended part 1 with a question hanging in the air. A civilization arguably the most sophisticated the Western world had ever produced had already solved the problem of urban sanitation more than 2,000 years ago. And yet, 1,000 years later, European cities were drowning in their own filth.
What happened? How does an entire civilization forget?
That question used to keep me up at night, and the answer, when I finally found it, turned out to be both more fascinating and more deeply unsettling than I expected. Let's go back, way back, to a city built on a swamp. Around the year 600, before the Common Era that's roughly 2,600 years ago, city that would become, Rome had a problem. It sat in a low-lying valley between 7 hills. When it rained, the valley flooded. When it didn't rain, the ground was still marshy and damp and deeply unpleasant. The Forum, the central public gathering place of what would one day be the heart of an empire, was basically a bog. A king named Tarquinius Priscus decided that was unacceptable. He ordered the construction of what would become one of the most extraordinary pieces of engineering in the ancient world. The Romans called it the Cloaca Maxima, which if you translate it directly from Latin means the greatest sewer. And I love that they didn't try to make it sound glamorous. They didn't call it the Grand Canal of Rome or the Sacred Channel of the Eternal City. They called it the greatest sewer because that is exactly what it was, and they were proud of it. Now, I want you to really understand what the Cloaca Maxima actually was, because I think the word sewer doesn't quite capture it. This was not a pipe. This was not a ditch. This was a tunnel. A massive vaulted tunnel built from volcanic rock and limestone, large enough, according to the Roman writer Pliny the Elder, for a wagon loaded with hay to pass through it. Pliny wrote about the Cloaca Maxima, roughly 700 years after it was first constructed. And even after 7 centuries, he was still astonished by it. He wrote, and I'm paraphrasing here, that massive blocks of stone were dragged along the streets above it, that buildings collapsed onto it, that the earth shook from earthquakes, and yet the tunnels remained well-nigh impregnable. 700 years of floods, 700 years of earthquakes, 700 years of the weight of an entire city pressing down on it from above, and it held. Parts of it are still holding today. Over 2,600 years after it was first built, the Cloaca Maxima is still partially functional. There are sections of that original tunnel beneath modern Rome that still redirect water toward the Tiber River, the same river it was designed to drain into all those centuries ago. Let that sink in for a moment. The Roman sewer system has been operating longer than most nations have existed. But here's where it gets really interesting, because the Cloaca Maxima wasn't just impressive as a single structure. It was impressive as part of a system. By the 1st century of the Common Era, roughly 2,000 years ago, Rome had 11 aqueducts. Massive engineering projects bringing fresh water into the city from sources as far as 60 miles away. And the Romans had figured something out that sounds simple but was actually brilliant. All that water flowing into the city through the public baths, through the public fountains, through the hundreds of thousands of homes eventually had to go somewhere. So they connected the outflow from the aqueducts directly into the sewer system. The result was a sewer that was constantly being flushed by fresh running water, not pooling, not stagnating, constantly moving, carrying waste out of the city and into the Tiber. The historian Lewis Mumford, writing in 1961 in his famous book, The City in History, called the Cloaca Maxima one of the cheapest pieces of engineering on record, because when you calculated the cost against the number of years it had been in continuous service, the price per year became almost negligible. A system built to last centuries. Designed by people who understood that infrastructure is not an expense, it is an investment in the future. And it wasn't just the sewer. Rome had public latrines, multi-seat facilities, some of them free to use, others charging a small fee. All of them connected to the drainage system. By the 2nd century, before the Common Era, public latrines existed throughout the city. Whether you were a senator or a street vendor, the infrastructure existed to handle your biological needs in an organized, sanitary way. Rome had laws protecting people from waste disposal hazards, actual written laws. One Roman legal text describes an ordinance that if you threw waste out of a window and it struck someone on the street, you were legally liable to pay damages to that person. The law, interestingly, only applied during daylight hours. The assumption being that at night, well, people should probably be watching where they're walking, which is either very practical or slightly terrifying. I'll let you decide. Rome had Marcus Agrippa, the trusted lieutenant of the Emperor Augustus Caesar, who in 33 years before the Common Era undertook a complete renovation and cleaning of the entire Cloaca Maxima. Agrippa was so committed to the project that, according to ancient sources, he personally traveled through sections of the tunnel by boat to inspect them firsthand. The man who helped run the Roman Empire spent his afternoon floating through the city's sewer system to check on the maintenance. That is what genuine civic commitment looks like. So here we have Rome, our city of over 1 million people, at its peak with running water, public baths, organized waste disposal, legal frameworks protecting public health, and sewer infrastructure so well built it outlasted the civilization that created it. And then I want you to really feel the weight of this. The empire fell. Not quickly, not in a single dramatic moment. Over the course of roughly 2 centuries, starting around the late 300s and continuing into the 400s and 50s, the Western Roman Empire gradually fragmented, contracted, and finally ceased to exist as a functioning political entity. The last Western Roman emperor, a young man named Romulus Augustulus, was deposed in 476 of the Common Era. And with the empire went something that nobody quite realized they were losing until it was already gone. The aqueducts required maintenance, constant, skilled, organized maintenance. Clearing debris, repairing cracks, maintaining the pressure systems that kept water flowing uphill and downhill through hundreds of miles of stone channels. When the Roman administrative system collapsed, the people who knew how to do that maintenance, the engineers, the specialists, the workers trained in those specific techniques either died, dispersed, or stopped being employed. One historian put it very simply. The aqueducts providing clean water to the cities were either destroyed or fell into irreparable disrepair because those who knew how to maintain them were gone. Gone. Not the knowledge that water flows downhill, not the concept of a pipe, but the specific, institutional, organized knowledge of how to maintain a system of that scale. That knowledge walked out the door with the empire, and it took nearly 1,000 years to find its way back. The aqueducts silted up. The connections from the aqueducts to the sewer system were severed. Without the constant flow of water flushing through the tunnels, the Cloaca Maxima lost its self-cleaning mechanism. Parts of it filled with sediment, parts of it collapsed, And into the vacuum left by all of that missing infrastructure, medieval European cities built themselves on top of it, literally on top of the ruins of Roman sanitation infrastructure. And they improvised. They dug cesspits. They built wooden latrines over rivers. Why assign people to collect waste in carts and haul it outside the city walls? These weren't bad ideas. They were reasonable attempts to manage an impossible problem with limited tools. But they were designed for a village, not for a city of 100,000 people. Now, and I want to pause here, because this part genuinely surprised me when I first learned it. You might be thinking, if Rome had all of this, why didn't the medieval cities just rebuild it? And the answer is not simply, they didn't know how. The answer is more complicated, and honestly more human. The fall of the Roman Empire didn't happen all at once. Remember, it happened gradually. And as it happened, the cities of Western Europe didn't suddenly empty out and start over. People kept living in them. They kept using whatever Roman infrastructure still worked. They repaired it roughly when they could. But here is the critical difference. Roman infrastructure was built and maintained by a centralized state apparatus, a government, with the authority to tax citizens, conscript labor, employ specialists, and execute multi-decade engineering projects. Medieval European cities didn't have that. They had feudal lords, church institution, N.S., and merchant guilds, each with their own interests, their own resources, and their own priorities. Coordinating them all to undertake a massive public works project was, to put it gently, not straightforward. And there was something else, something more subtle, but perhaps even more important. The Christian Church, which had become the dominant cultural institution of medieval Europe, had developed a complicated relationship with the body and its physical needs. Some of the most influential early Christian thinkers had begun to teach that the body was at best a vessel for the soul, and at worst a source of temptation and sin. Physical pleasure, including the pleasure of a warm bath, became associated with paganism, with the hedonistic culture of Rome that Christianity had specifically rejected. There's a famous quote attributed to Saint Jerome, one of the early church fathers, who reportedly wrote, "He who is bathed in Christ has no need of a second bath." Now, historians debate whether that quote is real or apocryphal, but the attitude it represents was very real. There were prominent religious figures in the early medieval period who went years or even decades without bathing and were praised for it as a sign of spiritual devotion. Bathing was associated with Roman paganism, and Roman paganism was what you were supposed to have left behind. So the infrastructure that enabled bathing, the public baths, the heated water systems, the elaborate plumbing was dismantled or repurposed, and the cultural habit of regular bathing faded. Does this mean medieval people were all filthy all the time? And I want to be fair here because history sometimes gets flattened into caricature. Medieval people bathed in rivers, in wooden tubs, in monasteries and castle chambers. Paris had 26 bathhouses operating simultaneously in the year 1292. The Crusaders, when they encountered Arab bathing culture in the Holy Land, came back to Europe fascinated by what they'd found and helped revive the tradition of steam baths on the continent. Medieval people were not ignorant of cleanliness. They cared about it. And this is the crucial distinction: they were operating without the infrastructure that made systematic cleanliness possible at urban scale. You can want to keep your city clean. You can pass laws about it. You can hire people to enforce those laws. But if the fundamental physics, sickle systems, the water supply, the drainage, the waste removal are not there at a scale proportional to your population, the city will drift back toward filth, no matter how much anyone wants it otherwise. And this is the insight that took London and all of European civilization 900 more years to fully grasp. Here's something I find worth sitting with for a moment. Think about whatever piece of infrastructure keeps your life running right now. The electrical grid, the water pipes, the sewage system, the internet, the supply chains that make sure your grocery store has food on its shelves. Most of us have no idea how any of it actually works. We didn't build it.
We didn't design it. We use it every day, and we trust completely that it will keep working, because it has always kept working in our lifetimes.
Now imagine the people who do know how to maintain it just stop. Not because they want to, just because the system that kept them employed and trained their replacements and funded the maintenance that system collapses. How long before you notice? How long before the consequences become truly catastrophic? The fall of Rome's sanitation infrastructure answers that question with brute precision. It took about 2 to 3 generations before the full collapse was felt. And it took nearly 1,000 years to rebuild. 1,000 years from the fall of Rome to the beginning of the modern era, during which European cities, including London, fumbled their way through the problem with inadequate tools, inadequate knowledge, and an inadequate understanding of exactly why things kept going wrong. But here's the other thing that Rome's story teaches us, and this is the part I think we don't talk about enough. Rome's system was extraordinary, but it wasn't perfect. A researcher named Piers Mitchell, writing in the journal Parasitology, published a study that looked at archaeological evidence for intestinal parasites across the Roman world. What he found was surprising. In the Bronze Age and Iron Age, before Rome built its elaborate sanitation infrastructure, certain parasites were relatively rare. After Rome built all those baths and sewers and aqueducts, whipworm, roundworm, dysentery, they actually increased during the Roman period. Because the Romans had a national food trade, they shipped a fermented fish sauce called garum across the entire empire from the coasts of Spain and Portugal and northern Europe all the way to Rome, and some of that fish was infected with fish tapeworm. The empire's very success at connecting distant places meant that parasites from one region could now travel to every other region. Globalization's first unintended consequence, you could say. The lesson there isn't that Roman sanitation was useless. It wasn't. It was genuinely revolutionary. The lesson is that solving one layer of a problem sometimes creates a new layer that you couldn't have predicted, and the bigger and more complex the system you build, the harder it becomes to see all the ways it might quietly fail. Which brings us back to London. Because London in the 1300s to the 1800s was not just a city that forgot what Rome had built. It was a city in the middle of something Rome never had to face. A population explosion so rapid, so unprecedented, that even if they had rebuilt the entire Roman infrastructure overnight, it probably wouldn't have been enough. Something was happening in London that was genuinely new in human history. And the next part of our story is where things get truly breathtakingly out of control. There is a particular kind of disco floor, RT, that comes from truly understanding a number. Not just hearing it, not just nodding along politely when someone reads it out loud, but actually stopping, closing your eyes, and letting the full weight of it land somewhere in your body. I want to try that with you right now. Ready? London, in the year 1300, had somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 people packed inside a walled area of roughly 450 acres. 450 acres. To put that into a frame you might recognize, Central Park in New York City is 840 acres, almost twice the size of the entire walled city of London at its medieval peak. Now, in those 450 acres, with those 80,000 to 100,000 people, let me give you the math that historian Dali Jorgensen worked out for a medieval city of just 10,000 residents. 10,000 people produce 900,000 liters of excrement per year, nearly 3 million liters of urine every year. Multiply that by 8. Multiply that by 10. And now remember, there is no underground drainage, no flushing system, no organized removal infrastructure at that scale. Just cesspits dug into the earth, a few wooden latrines hanging over rivers, and an increasingly desperate set of city ordinances that nobody has quite enough enforcement, power, to actually uphold. That is what London was sitting on top of every single day. But here's something that I think gets overlooked in most retellings of this story. People talk about London's filth as if it were just human waste, as if the problem was simply that too many people were relieving themselves in too small a space. That's true, but it's only about half the picture. The other half has 4 legs, sometimes 2 wings, and an absolutely spectacular capacity to make things worse. Medieval London was not just a city of people, it was a city of animals. On Milk Street, which still exists today as a street name in the City of London, cows were kept for milking right there in the urban centre. On Bread Street, bakers kept working horses. Smithfield, to the northwest of the city walls, hosted one of the largest livestock markets in England from the 10th century onward, where tens of thousands of animals changed hands every year and then walked or were carried directly into the city streets. And then there were the pigs. Oh, the pigs. Medieval Londoners kept pigs the way modern city dwellers keep dogs casually, naturally, as a completely normal feature of urban life. Except that, pigs, unlike dogs, have a tendency to break free from their enclosures and wander wherever they please, which they did constantly. There are records of the city paying monactual salaried city employees whose specific job was to kill unauthorized pigs found roaming the streets. These men were called swine killers, and, according to medieval London records, they were paid 4p for every pig they dispatched, equivalent to roughly a full day's wages for a skilled craftsman at the time. Think about what that tells you about the scale of the pig problem. This was not an occasional nuisance. This was a jobber, real, paid, necessary job, because there were enough pigs loose in London streets at any given moment that someone had to be specifically employed to deal with them. And every one of those pigs, along with every horse, every cow, every goat and chicken and goose, was producing waste constantly in the streets, in the markets, in the alleyways, between houses. A single horse produces somewhere between 15 and 35 pounds of manure per day. London had thousands of horses. You can do that math yourself, and I'll leave you to sit with the result. Now, let me introduce you to a professor. Sanitation that I think deserves far more attention than it usually gets in the history books. The gong farmers sometimes, called gong firmers, or simply night men were, the workers responsible for emptying London's cesspits. They worked exclusively at night, between 9 in the evening and 5 in the morning, by law. During daylight hours, they were not permitted to carry out their work in the city, partly to spare Londoners the sight, and partly, one assumes, to spare everyone involved a certain amount of social embarrassment. Their tools were simple: buckets, shovels, and wooden barrels loaded onto carts. Their job was to climb down into pits that were sometimes 12 feet deep, or more, scoop out the accumulated waste, carry it through the sleeping city, and deposit it at designated dump sites outside the walls. The dangers were real and serious. Methane gas accumulates in enclosed pits. There are historical records of gong farmers dying in cesspits, overcome by fumes, found the next morning by their colleagues. It was not a theoretical risk. It was a documented occupational hazard, and yet they were there every night, doing the work that made urban life even marginally. Why survivable? Now, here's the part that genuinely moves me. In 1328, a documented case from London's historical records, a cesspit belonging to neighbours named Adam and William Meyer had become so full, so overwhelmed with accumulated waste, that it had physically penetrated the stone wall between their property and the property of a man named William Spratt. The sewage had soaked through the stone, through the wall, and into Spratt's house. Spratt filed a formal complaint with city authorities, describing how the waste had entered his home and collected there, causing a great stench. That is a real complaint from a real person about real sewage seeping through his real walls in the year 1328. That detail so striking. Not because it's disgusting, though it absolutely is, but because of what it tells us about the pressure building underneath the surface of medieval urban life. Literally, building. Literally, pressure. The cesspits were so full, the density was so high, the accumulation so relentless, that the waste had nowhere left to go except sideways through solid stone into someone's home. That is not a sanitation problem. That is a physics problem. And physics. S does not care about ordinances. Let's talk about the butchers for a moment, because the butchers of medieval London are a story unto themselves. In a city without refrigeration, meat was sold and processed in centralized areas. London had a famous one called St. Nicholas Shambles, a cluster of butcher shops near what is now Newgate, where animals were slaughtered and processed in volume every day. The waste produced by those operations was considerable: blood, entrails, bones, hides, fat. The heads, hooves, and internal organs of cattle, pigs, and sheep, all of it had to go somewhere. And, in the absence of a sanitation system capable of handling that volume, the somewhere was almost always the nearest waterway. In 1368, slightly before the famous complaint from King Edward III about butcher waste that we mentioned in part, the mayor and aldermen of London issued a declaration specifically about the butchers of St. Nicholas Shambles. The document stated, in their own words, that because of the butchers' waste disposal practices, the water was rendered corrupt and generated fetid smells. Their recommendation: move the slaughterhouses outside the city. The king agreed. An official decree was issued. Now, here's the part where history gets to remind us of something important. 40 years later, the same complaint was being filed again. The butchers were still there. The waste was still going into the river. The river was still, in the city's own words, corrupt and fetid. Because here's the fundamental problem with telling people to move their businesses elsewhere. Their businesses are where their customers are. Their customers are in the city. And unless you are prepared to physically force the relocatient to literally demolish the shops and build new facilities outside the walls, the decree is just words. It was always just words. Here's something I find genuinely fascinating and a little uncomfortable about this entire period. There's a scholar named Dolly Jorgensen at the University of Stavanger whose research I've drawn on throughout this story, and she makes a subtle but important point about how we tend to interpret medieval urban sanitation. She argues that the popular image of medieval cities as uniformly, relentlessly filthy the image we have from popular culture, from Hollywood films, from 1,000 history documentaries is actually somewhat exaggerated. Ted. Not wrong, but exaggerated. Her research shows that in many northern European cities, there were real functioning systems. Tax-funded street sweepers, night soil collectors on regular schedules, formal rules about when fishmongers had to clear away their waste, designated dump sites outside city walls, even, and this surprised me, some archaeological evidence from cities like Trondheim in Norway suggests that human waste was carefully buried rather than simply left to accumulate on streets. The medieval city was not just a passive victim of its own filth. City governments tried. People cared. There was genuine civic effort, and here is the critical word: those systems had a ceiling. A maximum capacity beyond which they simply could not function. In a city of 10,000 people, regular waste collection can work. In a city of 50,000, you need to scale everything up significantly, and it starts to strain. In a city of 100,000, with all those animals, all those slaughterhouses, all those overflowing cesspits, all those horses and pigs in the streets, you have crossed a threshold where the gap between what the system can handle and what the city actually produces is no longer manageable. Able through effort alone, you need a fundamentally different system, and that is the insight that London and every medieval European city was not yet equipped to act on. Not because the insight was unavailable, but because the engineering, the political will, the financing, and the institutional frameworks required to build a fundamentally different system at urban scale simply did not exist yet. They would need to be invented under enormous pressure over several centuries. There's one more thing I want to tell you about this period, because it reveals something about the relationship between knowledge and action that I find profoundly relevant not just to the 14th century, but to any era, including our own. In 1332, before the Black Death arrived, before the worst of it all, King Edward III travelled to the city of York for a parliamentary meeting, and when he arrived, he was appalled by what he found. He wrote, and this is a direct historical record preserved in the parliamentary rolls, that he detested the abominable smell abounding in the said city, more than any other city of the realm, from dung and manure and other filth and dirt, wherewith the streets and lanes are filled and obstructed. He detested it more than any other city in the realm. This was the King of England. He had travelled to many cities. He had a frame of reference, and York, in his judgment, was the worst. He ordered a cleaning. He issued a decree. He put the full authority of the Crown behind a sanitation directive, and then he left. And 16 years later, when the plague arrived, when the rats and their fleas found the perfect breeding ground in those streets that the king had detested and decreed and departed, York lost roughly half its population. The knowledge existed. The authority existed. The will briefly existed. What did not exist was the system capable of sustaining that will beyond the moment of the crisis. Once the king left, once the immediate urgency faded, the streets slowly filled back up. The complaints resumed. The cesspits overflowed again. The pigs came back. Because without permanent infrastructure, civic hygiene is not a problem you solve. It is a problem you manage imperfectly every single day. And the moment the management stops, the problem returns. London had not yet learned that lesson. Not fully. It would take 5 more centuries and 1 unbearable summer to learn. It's the 13th century, and I keep promising we'll get there, and we will, I promise. There is a cultural dimension to all of this that I think is one of the most fascinating and underexplored parts of the story. Because what we've been talking about so far is the physical reality of medieval London. The numbers, the animals, the cesspits, the impossible scale of the problem. But human beings don't just respond to physical reality. They respond to what physical reality means to them, to the stories they tell themselves about why things are the way they are, to the rituals and customs and social codes that develop around even the most basic biological necessities. And in medieval and early modern Europe, the act of disposing of waste, of throwing it out a window, of emptying a chamber pot, of declaring which side of the street was the clean side had developed its own elaborate, specific, occasionally baffling cultural etiquette. There was, for instance, a single shouted word that was supposed to signal to anyone walking below that something was about to come down from above. And that word, and the strange little world of customs and conflicts that surrounded it, turns out to be one of the most illuminating windows into what everyday life in a medieval city actually felt like from the sidewalk up. That's where we're going next. Picture this. It's 10 on a Tuesday evening, somewhere in the old city of Edinburgh. The bells of St. Giles High Kirk have just finished ringing that slow, deliberate toll that everyone in the city knows to listen for. The streets are mostly dark. Lanterns flicker in a few windows. You're walking home after a long day, tired, maybe a little cold, navigating the narrow cobblestone alley between 2 rows of towering tenement buildings that rise 5, 6, 7 stories above you on either side. You're thinking about nothing in particular. And then from somewhere far above you, you hear a shout. One word. Gardaloo! You have about 2 seconds, maybe 3 if you're lucky. Your body moves before your brain does. You press yourself against the wall. You cover your head. You close your eyes. And then comes the sound, the splash, the smell. And if you moved fast enough, if the person above you was even marginally considerate about the angle of their throw, you walk away with only a few splatters on your coat. If you did not move fast enough, well, you have a very different kind of evening ahead of you. Welcome to the front line of urban life in medieval and early modern Europe, where the simplest act of walking down the street required reflexes, situational awareness, and a very good relationship with your laundry service. And that word, Gardaloo, is where we're starting tonight, because it is not just a funny historical anecdote. It is a window into the entire social architecture of how people lived with waste, negotiated around waste, and built elaborate systems of custom and law and etiquette, trying to manage something that fundamentally could not be managed at the scale it needed to be. Let's start with the word itself, because its origins are genuinely fascinating. Gardyloo is a Scottish corruption of a French phrase. The original expression was Prines garde, aloe, which translates to watch out for the water. Some sources trace it to the slightly shorter gare de l'eau, to watch the water, while others connect it to regardes l'eau, meaning look out for the water. The fact that it came from French is not surprising. French was the prestige language of educated, upper-class society across much of medieval Europe, and phrases that travelled from the continent, especially ones related to social etiquette, often carried a French flavour. What is surprising is the documented moment this word entered official record. According to the Wiktionary etymology, the word Gardyloo first appears in writing in 1662 in the Burgh Records of Edinburgh. That's an official city document, not a piece of literature, not a poem, an administrative record. And what that tells us is that by 1662, the practice of emptying chamber pots from upper floor windows was so common, so regular, so thoroughly embedded in the daily rhythm of city life, that it had its own coup à fronteau, official vocabulary, its own recognized protocol, its own entry in the civic record. This was not an occasional accident. This was routine. This was the system. Now, let me paint the full picture of how this actually worked, because there's more social structure here than you might expect. Edinburgh at the time was a city of extraordinary vertical density. The medieval street plan followed the natural geography of a long ridge running from Edinburgh Castle down to Holyrood Palace. On either side of this central ridge, the land dropped away steeply, creating narrow valleys, and because there was only so much room on the ridge itself, the city grew upward. The tenement buildings of Edinburgh's Old Town were genuinely tall by the standards of the era. Some reached 10 stories or more, remarkable structures for a pre-industrial city, and ones that created their own very particular challenges. By the late 1700s, when Daniel Defoe visited Edinburgh, he wrote that he believed no city in the world had so many people living in so little space. The population density was astonishing. Multiple families sharing a single building, a single staircase, sometimes a single floor, and all of them with exactly the same biological needs, and all of them with exactly the same extremely limited options for where to send the resulting waste. The answer for many residents was the window. Here's the official system, as it was formalized over time. In Edinburgh, by custom and eventually by law, the acceptable window for emptying chamber pots was the nighttime hours. The bells of St. Giles at 10 o'clock in the evening were effectively the starting gun. From that moment until the following morning, the windows opened, and the city, as one historical document described, resounded with one universal cry. Gardyloo. One observer in 1745 wrote that as soon as St. Giles' clock struck 10, the windows were simultaneously opened for a general discharge, and he noted with some dark humour that this must have rather alarmed Prince Charles's followers when they occupied the city that year. Imagine occupying a foreign city and discovering that at precisely 10 o'clock every single night, the entire population simultaneously begins throwing the contents of their chamber pots out the windows. Military manuals do not prepare you for that. But here's what I find most interesting about the entire Gardyloo system. It wasn't lawless. It wasn't chaos. It was a negotiated social ritual, with rules, with responses, with etiquette. When you heard Gardyloo called from above, you had a recognized response. In Scotland, the callback was "Hold your horn," "Hold your hand," which was the pedestrians' official request for a brief pause, giving them time to step into a doorway and reduce the splash radius. Think about that for a moment. There was an established call, an established response, an established grace period. Everyone in the City knew the system. Everyone participated in it. This is not a culture of careless disregard. This is a culture that has organized itself around an unavoidable problem as thoughtfully as it can, given the tools available. The problem is not the attitude of the people. The problem is the architecture. When you live 10 stories above the street with no plumbing, no running water, no connection to a drainage system, and a full chamber pot that needs emptying before morning, what exactly are your options? You carry it down 10 flights of stairs, through multiple families, shared stairwell in the dark, and somehow dispose of it where? In the street. That's the same result, just closer to ground level. Into the cesspit. The cesspit is already overwhelmed. For many residents, the window was not a choice born of laziness or indifference. It was the least bad option available in an impossible situation. Now, in 1749, the city of Edinburgh finally decided that the informal Gardilu system was no longer adequate, and so they passed a law. It was called, with magnificent directness, the Nastiness Act. You have to appreciate a legislative body that names a bill exactly what it is. The Nastines. Act formalized the hours during which waste could be disposed of from windows. Between May and July, it was permitted between 9 o'clock in the evening and 6 o'clock in the morning. Between October and February, it was allowed between 8 o'clock in the evening and 8 o'clock in the morning. And the penalty for violating these hours was a fine of 5 shillings. 5 shillings was not trivial. It was a meaningful amount of money for many residents. The city was serious. And yet, the smell did not go away. In 1773, 24 years after the Nastiness Act, the English writer and lexicographer Dr. Samuel Johnson visited Edinburgh with his friend James Boswell. Boswell describes the moment they walked arm in arm up the High Street toward his home in James's Court on a dusky night. He writes with a sort of rueful resignation that he could not prevent his being assailed by the evening effluvia of Edinburgh. His companion Dr. Johnson walked through the lingering smell of Edinburgh's streets and, in the dark, turned to Boswell and said quietly, "I smell you in the dark." That sentence is still one of my favorite things anyone has ever said about urban sanitation. It is simultaneously a complaint, a philosophy. Cal observation, and coming from one of the greatest literary minds of 18th century England, a kind of unintentional poetry. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. If you had been a resident of Edinburgh in 1750, and someone explained to you exactly why the smell would never fully go away, that the building heights, the population density, the lack of running water, and the narrow geography of the old town made it genuinely impossible to solve without rebuilding the entire city, would you have believed them? Would you have believed that the solution to this problem was to literally build a completely new city? Because that is exactly what Edinburgh eventually did. In the 1760s, the city began planning and constructing what became known as the New Towner, planned urban extension built on a rational grid with wide streets, sewers, proper drainage, and buildings designed from the start with sanitation in mind. Wealthier residents moved out of the old town and into the new town almost immediately, taking their money and their political influence with them. The old town, stripped of its elite population and its resources, fell into decline. Its tenements, magnificent in their own terrible way, became slums. The very architecture that produced the Gardilu system became a symbol of urban poverty. The solution to a sanitation problem had required not just new rules, not just new enforcement, not just new habits, but a completely new city built next to the old one, designed around the problem rather than in spite of it. Now, let me share with you something I discovered while researching this story that genuinely stopped me in my tracks. You know the word cheerio, you probably use it, or at least recognize it. The breezy British goodbye, the cheerful farewell, the light and easy parting word. Did you know it comes from this? According to linguistic historians, in the medieval period, when wealthy residents of these tall tenement buildings went out, they were often carried in chairs by servants' sedan chairs, as they were called, as a way of avoiding the filth and hazards of the street. When the servants carrying these chairs were moving through the streets and could hear a gare de loup cry from above, they would shout upward to alert the thrower that someone important was passing below. Their shout was chair below. Over time, through the slippage in compressio, that words always undergo in everyday speech, chair below became cheerio. One of the most cheerful, carefree words in the English language, began as a desperate shout trying to prevent a bucket of waste from falling on a wealthy passenger's head. I think about that every time someone says goodbye to me now. And while we're here, the word loo, which the British have called a bathroom for generations, that comes directly from gare de loup itself. The loo, at the end of the warning cry, became the name for the place the warning cry was about. Language is a time machine, and sometimes it takes you to places you genuinely did not expect. But I want to come back to something more substantive before we move on, because the gare de loup story is more than just a collection of amusing linguistic footnotes. Think about what that entire system represented. The warning cry, the official response, the nastiness act, the hours of permitted disposal, the 5-shilling fines. All of it was effort, real, genuine, organized civic effort to manage an impossible problem, and all of it was fundamentally backward-facing. What I mean is, every single element of the gare de loup system was designed to manage waste after it had already been produced, in buildings that had no drainage. No one in Edinburgh, in 1749, sat down and said, "What if we built the buildings differently? What if we created a drainage network? What if we restructured the entire physical infrastructure of the city so that this problem doesn't exist in the first place?" Because that kind of thinking requires something that is extraordinarily rare in human history. The ability to imagine, with sufficient clarity and conviction, a world that is fundamentally different from the one you currently live in. When you have grown up with the gare de loup cry, when everyone you know has grown up with it, when it has been part of the sound of the city for generations, it stops being a problem to solve and starts being just the way things are. The sociologists have a term for this: normalization of deviance. The gradual process by which something that should be seen as dangerous or unacceptable becomes so familiar that it stops triggering the alarm response that it should. It is one of the most powerful forces in human civilization, and it explains, perhaps better than anything else, why the cities of medieval and early modern Europe, despite laws, despite enforcement, despite genuine civic will, could not solve their sanitation problems until something happened that was so overwhelming, so undeniable, so catastrophically impossible to normalize that the alarm response finally kicked in for an entire civilization at once. What that something was in London's case, we're getting closer to. But first, we need to cross the English Channel, because while Edinburgh was developing the gare de loup system and London was debating its cesspits, a city was quietly becoming the most extravagant paradox in European history. A city that, at the very same time it was reaching the absolute peak of its filth, was producing what many historians consider the most beautiful royal gardens ever constructed. A city of stunning contradictions, where the streets had been named after excrement and the palace fountains ran with perfumed water, and the king himself, the most powerful man in Europe, had a solution to the smell problem that was somehow both ingenious and completely insane. We are going to Paris. Cross the English Channel with me for a moment. Leave behind the Edinburgh tenements and their gare de loup cries. Leave London's overflowing cesspits and the gong farmers working through the night. Sail south across that narrow strip of grey water and arrive in the most elegant, the most cultured, the most exquisitely self-conscious city in the known world, Paris. In the 17th century, Paris was what every other European city aspired to be. Its court set the standards of fashion, architecture, cuisine, language, and manners for an entire civilization. To be sophisticated, to be refined, to be truly civilized, was to be in some sense Parisian. And yet, if you had walked through the center of medieval Paris on any given day, You would have made your way past streets with names like Rue Merdieu, Rue de la Murderie, Rue Murderet, all of them named for the French word, merde, which, if you don't know French, means exactly what you think it means. And alongside those streets, tucked away on a municipal map, as though it were the most natural thing in the world, a lane simply called Rue du Pipi. These were real streets on real maps in the most fashionable city in Europe. Now, I've thought about this a great deal, and I keep coming back to one question. What does it mean for a civilization to name its streets after excrement? The easy answer is it means things were very dirty. But I think the more interesting answer is different. I think it means something was working, after a fashion. Because here's what those street names tell us that we often miss. The people who named those streets were not embarrassed by them. They were not naming them ironically, or as a joke, or as a rebuke. They were naming them the way you name any geographic feature, descriptively. Way you call a river, clear water, or a hill, the tall one. You look at it, you find the most obvious characteristic, you give it a name. In medieval Paris, the most obvious characteristic of those particular streets was what flowed through them, and that fact, the simple acceptance of it, the administrative matter-of-factness of it, reveals something profound about how people understood their urban environment. This was not hidden. This was not shameful. This was just the way the city was catalogued and mapped and named accordingly. The question that haunts me is, what would a map of our own cities look like if we named things with that same brutal honesty? But let's not let Paris off too easily, because Paris did not just have a few dirty streets. Paris, in the mid-17th century, was in a state of crisis. The city had grown dramatically from roughly 300,000 people in the early 1500s. Paris swelled to over 400,000 by the mid-1600s, making it the largest city in Europe outside of Constantinople. That level of population growth, crammed into a medieval street plan never designed to accommodate it, had produced conditions that shocked even people who were accustomed to urban squalor. The Seine, the river that literally defined Paris, the river, around which the entire city was organized, had become, by the 16th century, essentially an open sewer. Tanneries on the left bank dumped their chemicals and animal waste directly into the water. Slaughterhouses near Les Halles let blood and entrails run in rivulets toward the river. The smaller tributaries of the Seine streams that had once been clear enough to drink from had turned the color of clay and smelled accordingly. And the streets themselves. One historical account from the period describes the condition of Paris so vividly that it has stayed with me since the first time I read it. A witness described the roads of Paris as a mixture of water, animal blood, rotting food, and human waste, forming a compound so thick that it had its own name. Parisians called it La Boue de Paris, the mud of Paris, and unlike ordinary mud, this substance did not dry out in summer. It only thickened and concentrated and began to produce its own particular smell. The French language, being the French language, even developed a specific vocabulary for the phenomenon. Here's the peculiar genius and the peculiar blindness of Louis XIV. Louis XIV, wow. Perhaps the most powerful monarch who ever ruled France. The Sun King, the man who looked at the French nobility and said, essentially, you will all come and live in my palace at Versailles, where I can watch you. The man who built Versailles specifically to project an image of absolute, unassailable, divinely touched power. And Versailles was genuinely extraordinary. The gardens of Versailles, designed by the great landscape architect André Le Nôtre, remain to this day among the most breathtaking formal gardens ever created. There were over 1,600 water jets, operating by the end of Louis XIV's reign, fed by an engineering system considered one of the wonders of the age. Kings and ambassadors from across the world came to Versailles and genuinely could not believe what they were seeing. So here's the paradox I promised you. At the exact same moment that Paris was reaching the highest levels of filth in its history the exact moment that La Bau de Paris was at its worst. The streets were at their most impossible. The Seine was at its most polluted. Louis the 14th was channeling the most advanced hydraulic engineering of his era into making sure the fountains of Versailles ran perfectly. TLY. He built a contraption of wheels and pumps, driven by the power of the Seine at Marly that was considered the eighth wonder of the world at the time, capable of pumping millions of gallons of water uphill to supply the fountains of Versailles. Iron pipes stretched 18.5 miles from the river to the palace grounds. Iron pipes, miles of them, to supply the fountains, while Paris itself had no covered sewers, while the streets were named after excrement, while 400,000 people drank from the same river that received the city's waste. Now, I want to be fair to Louis XIV here, because history is never as simple as it looks from the comfortable distance of 400 years. He was not indifferent to Paris. In 1666, the year before he appointed the man who would become France's first Lieutenant General of Police, Louis, and his finance minister, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, convened a committee to address the disorder of the capital. The meeting was held with deliberate symbolic weight in the magnificent gallery of the Royal Chancellor's home on the Rue de Grenelle, a room lined with soaring windows and elaborate plasterwork frescoes. Colbert at the head of a long table covered inside. N. Purple felt, argued, that it was time to, in his own words, purge the city of what was causing its disorders. And in March of 1667, Louis appointed Gabriel Nicolas de la Reynie as the first Lieutenant General of Police of Paris. This was a genuinely significant moment. La Reynie was not just given the authority to enforce laws. He was given the authority to create them, to organize the existing patchwork of competing civic institutions into something resembling a unified urban government, and to implement for the first time in Paris's history a systematic approach to public order. One of his first acts was to impose what he called a mud tax on every Parisian with a propertier direct levy specifically to fund street cleaning. La Reynie imposed that tax to the grumbling of citizens and used the proceeds to fund regular street sweeping across the city. He also installed public street lighting, 2,736 lanterns across 912 streets, each one mandated to stay lit every night of the year. Paris became the first city in the world to light its streets systematically after dark. And, for a brief, remarkable period by some accounts, within a few years of La Reynie's appointment, Paris was genuine, nearly becoming cleaner and safer than it had ever been. A contemporary publication described the results with something approaching astonishment. The number of assassins, poisoners, and prostitutes has decreased, and the streets are much less muddy. Less muddy, not clean, but less muddy. Progress. But then there is Versailles. And Versailles, as it turned out, was not exempt from the problem that had brought Paris to its knees. Let me tell you something about the Palace of Versailles that they do not put on the tourist brochures. At its peak, Versailles housed approximately 10,000 people. Royals, aristocrats, government officials, servants, soldiers, cooks, footmen, ladies-in-waiting, musicians. 10,000 human beings living in varying degrees of proximity to the most powerful monarch in Europe. 10,000 people. And at the time of its greatest splendor, the 1680s, the SIX Chinese letter IES of the 70s, the Palace of Versailles had, for all its grandeur, no organized sanitation system to speak of. There were latrines. There were chamber pots, about 300 of them for the entire court, which was, as you may calculate for yourself, an extraordinary undersupply for 10,000 people. The latrines overflowed. The chapter. Amber pots were emptied into hallways and inner courtyards, and on occasion out of windows onto the carefully manicured grounds below. A German princess named Elizabeth Charlotte, who was at the French court in 1702, wrote in a letter that is preserved in the historical record. "The people stationed in the galleries in front of our room piss in all the bare corners. It is impossible to leave one's apartments without seeing somebody pissing." Read that again. It is impossible to leave one's apartments without seeing somebody pissing. This was not a medieval alleyway. This was not a London slum. This was the most prestigious address in the civilized world. The palace that embodied everything Louis XIV wanted the world to believe about France, about monarchy, and about himself. And you could not walk down the hallway without encountering someone in the act of urination. The Duc de Saint-Simon, one of the most incisive diarists of the period, whose memoirs are a masterwork of observed court life, recorded with ruthless candor that a certain Princess d'Harcourt was so indifferent to the problem that she would urinate while walking, leaving her servants to deal with the results. Louis XIV hymns. Elf, by multiple accounts, conducted meetings with foreign ambassadors while sitting on his commode, not because he was particularly informal, but because this was how court ritual worked. The king's bodily functions had been elevated through the elaborate theatre of Versailles into public events. To be permitted to attend the king during his morning toilet was a privilege. To be present while he used his commode was a mark of favor. Hygiene had not been privatized. It had been publicized and performed and turned into a display of power. Now, here's the detail I find the most remarkable of all, the one that for me crystallizes the entire Paris paradox into a single image. Louis XIV's solution to the smell problem at Versailles was to place his beloved orange trees, hundreds of them, in enormous decorative vases throughout the interior of the palace. The idea was that their fragrance would help mask the odor, and alongside the orange trees, perfume an enormous, systematic, extraordinarily sophisticated culture of perfume developed at the French court precisely because it was needed. Louis XIV was known to change his shirt multiple times a day as a form of hygiene, since bathing with water. Éter was considered dangerous. Clean linen was the substitute. The historian Alain Corbin wrote that at Versailles, to use excessive amounts of perfume was to protect oneself and to purify the surrounding air. The French perfume industry, still to this day one of the most prestigious in the world, owes a significant part of its origins to a palace that smelled of human waste and needed the fragrance industry to become sophisticated enough to cover it. The City of Light, the City of Perfume. Both names, it turns out, contain a story about the smell of a city that Paris was desperately trying to leave behind. Let me close this section with a comparison that I think tells the whole story in miniature. In 1667, at the exact moment that La Reynie was imposing his mud tax and installing his 2,700 lanterns, Louis XIV was simultaneously approving the design plans for the Gardens of Versailles. Two projects, both authorized by the same king, both in the same year. One project cost the equivalent of millions in modern currency and involved the most ambitious hydraulic engineering in the world: iron pipes, pumping stations, reservoirs, 1,600 water jets to make the fountains of a royal garden run continuously. The other project imposed a small tax on citizens to fund people with brooms. One of these projects is remembered today as one of the great achievements of French civilization. The other is a footnote, and that asymmetry, the enormous energy directed toward spectacle and the modest, grudging, insufficient effort directed toward the basic sanitary needs of 400,000 people, captures something important about how power and beauty and public health have always existed in uncomfortable tension with each other. Paris eventually solved its sanitation problem, but it took almost 2 more centuries, a revolution, the deaths of tens of thousands from cholera, and a man named Baron Haussmann, who tore down roughly 60% of the medieval city and rebuilt it from the ground up in order to do it. The streets named after excrement are gone now, renamed, absorbed, demolished. The medieval geography of Paris that produced them no longer exists, but beneath the broad boulevards and the elegant arrondissements that replaced them, the memory of what Paris once was, what it smelled like, what it cost the people who lived there, still lies quietly in the archaeological layers under the city's feet. We have been looking at this problem from a distance, from a historian's vantage point, from the perspective of kings and city planners and writers who observed it from above. But I want to bring us back down to street level, because this story is not, at its core, about monarchs and their fountains and their paradoxes. It is about ordinary people, the people who actually lived in these cities, who actually worked in them, who actually breathed the air and drank the water, and every night went to sleep and woke up the next morning to find that nothing had changed. And among those people, there was a group whose existence was the most necessary and the most invisible, whose labor was the absolute foundation on which every city in this story was built, and who have received almost no recognition in the centuries since. We need to talk about the night soil men. Let everything else go quiet for a moment. We have been talking about the cesspits, the gong farmers, the pigs in the pong farmers, the pigs in the pa, flung from upper windows, the streets named after excrement. All of it was unpleasant, all of it was costly. All of it made life in medieval European cities harder, shorter, and less dignified than it should have been. But unpleasant and deadly are different things. And in October of 1347, unpleasant became something else entirely. A fleet of Genoese trading ships docked at the port of Messina in Sicily. The sailors aboard them were already dying. Those who weren't dead yet had strange black swellings at their armpits, and in their groins swellings the size of eggs or apples, oozing blood and pus. The ships were ordered back out to sea immediately. The port authorities of Messina refused to let the sailors disembark, but it was already too late. The rats had left the ships before anyone could stop them, and the rats carried fleas, and the fleas carried Yersinia pestis. And in the weeks and months that followed, a disease that would kill between 75 and 200 million people began its march across the most densely populated, most thoroughly filth-soaked continent on Earth. Welcome to the Black Death. Now, I want to tell you this story with the honesty it deserves, because the Black Death is one of those events in history that we think we understand. We have the images, the beaked-nosed plague doctors, the death carts, the crosses painted on doors, the bonfires. We have the statistics. 1/3 of Europe's population, 25 million dead in 5 years, entire villages erased from maps. But the experience of it, what it actually felt like to live through, or to try to live through, is something that most retellings gloss over in the rush to get to the numbers. So let me slow down for a moment and tell you what it was actually like. The first sign was fever. Then came the swellings, the buboes, they were called, from the Greek word for groin, because that was where they often first appeared. Swelling so painful that infected people could not walk, could not sleep, could not lie still. And then the swellings turned black, the color that gave the disease its name. Internal bleeding darkened the skin. Whole patches of a person's body would turn the color of bruised night. Most people died within 2 to 7 days of those first symptoms appearing. 2 to 7 days from feeling perfectly healthy to dead in under a week. The physician Gentile da Foligno, chief physician at the University of Perugia and one of the most respected medical minds in Italy, wrote in 1348 that this was worse than anything he had ever encountered in his entire career. He died, of the plague, before the year was out. Here's what I want you to understand about why the plague spread the way it did. It did not simply kill people at random. It followed the geography of filth with terrifying precision. Cities which we have spent 5 parts of this story understanding as environments of accumulated waste, of rats and fleas and overflowing cesspits, of water that was more sewage than river cities died at catastrophic rates. In crowded urban areas, mortality could reach 50%, half the population. In some neighborhoods of Paris, where the street names told you everything you needed to know about the conditions underfoot, where the density was highest and the drainage worst, the mortality was even higher. By contrast, isolated rural villages without the rat populations that city filth nourished, without the density that let plague move from body to body, these often fared significantly better. It was not fate. It was not divine punishment. It was not the alignment of planets or the wrath of a disappointed god. It was rats and the fleas they carried, and the filth that fed those rats. The infrastructure of squalor that we've been documenting across the whole history of. For this story, every overflowing cesspit, every animal carcass left in the street, every bucket of waste dumped in an alley had been quietly feeding a population of rats that was about to become one of the most lethal forces in human history. Now, here's something that the people of 1347 got exactly right and exactly wrong at the same time. They knew the smell was connected to the disease. Medieval medicine operated on what was called the miasma theory. The belief that disease was caused by foul air, by the invisible poison that rose from decaying matter and polluted the atmosphere. Bad air, quite literally, in Latin, mal-aria, from which we derive the word malaria. The plague doctors who moved through dying cities wore elaborate leather suits and those famous long-beaked masks. And those masks were not theatrical. They were functional. The beaks were stuffed with fragrant herbs, lavender, mint, roses specifically to filter out what the doctors believed was poisoned air. The doctors were wrong about the mechanism. Foul air does not cause plague. Flea bites do. No amount of lavender in your beak prevents a flea from jumping onto your ankle. But here's the profound irony. By telling people to flee from areas of bad smell, by advising them to avoid the neighborhoods where the stench was worst, medieval doctors were accidentally and without understanding why telling people to get away from the worst rat infestations. Because the places that smelled the worst were precisely the places where waste accumulated most densely, and waste-dense places were rat-dense places. The advice was right. The reasoning was wrong. And that gap between accidentally correct advice and correct understanding would cost millions of lives before the actual mechanism was identified. Let me tell you about a pattern that I find one of the most haunting in this entire story. As the plague swept through city after city, the people living in them made a series of decisions that, in retrospect, made everything worse. One of the most consequential was this. In London, in Paris, in city after city, the authorities ordered the killing of dogs and cats. The reasoning was straightforward from within the miasma framework. Animals were unclean. They were associated with the bad air. They might be carriers of the disease, or at least symbols of the corruption that had brought it. And so in London during NG, the outbreak of 1665, 3 centuries after the Black Death, but in the same tradition the Lord Mayor issued an order to kill all dogs and cats in the city. Estimates suggest that 200,000 dogs and 40,000 cats were killed. 200,000 dogs, 40,000 cats, animals whose entire ecological function in a medieval city was to hunt and kill rats. The people who ordered that cull had no way of knowing what they were doing. They were acting rationally within their understanding of the world. They were trying to save lives. They believed they were doing the right thing. But by eliminating the primary predators of the rat population, they removed the only natural check on the creatures that were actually spreading the disease. The rat population, already large, grew larger. The flea population grew with it. The plague accordingly burned more intensely. I sit with that for a long time. The tragedy of trying to help and making things catastrophically worse because the essential knowledge was missing. Now, there is one more layer to this story that I think deserves its own space, because it is perhaps the most morally important part of everything we have discussed. As the plague spread through Europe, in the late 1340s, as cities emptied and graveyards overflowed and the dead piled in the streets, faster than anyone could carry them away, people were desperate for an explanation. Not just a medical explanation, but a moral one. Because the question at the center of any pandemic, in any era, is the same. Why us? Why now? Who is responsible? And in 14th century Europe, with no germ theory, with no understanding of bacterial transmission, with only theology and astrology and folk belief as frameworks, the answer that emerged was one of the most catastrophic errors of collective judgment in human history. The Jews poisoned the wells. That was the accusation. That was the story that spread faster in some places than the plague itself. And across the Rhine Valley, across France, across Switzerland and Germany, Jewish communities were massacred in advance of the plague's arrival. In February of 1349, 2,000 Jews were murdered in Strasbourg. In the summer of that same year, the Jewish communities of Mainz and Cologne were exterminated. By 1351, 60 major and 150 minor Jewish communities had been destroyed. And the specific trigger for the accusation, the thing that made people look at their Jewish neighbors and see potential murderers rather than fellow human beings dying of the same disease, was a perceived disparity in mortality rates. People believed, and in some areas may have been correct, that Jewish communities seemed to be dying at lower rates than their neighbors. And they were right to notice, but completely wrong about the reason. Some historians have argued that Jewish religious law, the halakha, required regular ritual hand-washing before meals, after using a latrine, upon waking each morning. The practice of netilat yadayim and washing before eating had been codified in Jewish tradition for over 1,000 years before the Black Death. More significantly, there is evidence that some Jewish communities, by living in more isolated ghettos, away from the worst of the shared public infrastructure, the communal wells, the open sewers, the densest rat populations, may have had somewhat reduced exposure, not through any deliberate strategy, but through the accident of physical separation. Now, historians debate this. Some point out that the plague was transmitted by flea bites, not by contaminated water, which limits how much hand-washing alone could have helped. Others named that plenty of Jewish communities were devastated by the plague, and that the idea of Jewish immunity was significantly exaggerated in contemporary accounts. But here is what is not debatable. Whatever difference existed, whether real or perceived, was a product of circumstance and tradition, not conspiracy, not malice. And the people who saw that difference and interpreted it as evidence of poisoning were doing what terrified human beings have always done under impossible pressure. They were looking for a story that explained their suffering. They were looking for a cause they could act against. Because acting against something, even the wrong, something feels less terrifying than accepting that the universe is indifferent, and a bacterium is killing you, and there is nothing you can do. Pope Clement VI, who watched the massacres from his palace at Avignon, horrified, issued 2 papal bulls in 1348, explicitly stating that the Jews were not to blame, that they were dying of the plague themselves, that the accusations were false, and that the violence must stop. He was mostly ignored, and the killings went on. The Black Death ended, or rather subsided, around 1353. In 5 years, it had killed somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's entire population. And what followed was one of the strangest, most counterintuitive outcomes in all of social history. The survivors were, in many ways, better off. Not immediately, not for years, but structurally, over time, because there were now far fewer people competing for the same resources. Agricultural land that had once barely sustained a family could now feed that family and produce surplus. Wages rose because labor was scarce. Peasants, who had previously been locked into feudal servitude, found, for the first time, that their work had real market value, and that landowners who needed them to survive would negotiate rather than command. In some sense, the plague broke open the medieval social structure in ways that centuries of gradual change had not managed. The catastrophe created the cracks through which the Renaissance would eventually emerge. But the sanitation problem, the filth that had nourished the rats, that had spread the fleas, that had carried the bacteria, with 1/3 of the population gone, the immediate pressure was reduced. Cities that had been catastrophically overcrowded were now half empty. The cesspits were easier to manage. The rats had fewer bodies to feed on, but the infrastructure was no cleaner. The knowledge was no greater. The system, or rather, the profound absence of a system, was no different. And as the population slowly recovered over the following century, the cycle would begin again. More people, more waste, more rats, more fleas. The Black Death would return in wave after wave for 3 more centuries. London would suffer 16 significant plague outbreaks between 1348 and the Great Plague of 1665. 16 outbreaks in 300 years. Because you cannot solve a disease problem without solving the environmental conditions that enable it. And as long as the filth remained, as long as the rats had something to eat and a place to live, and human populations dense enough to infect, the disease would always find a way back. The world needed a different kind of reckoning, a different kind of clarity. Not a plague that killed a third of the population and then receded, allowing everyone to return to the old ways. Something more concentrated, more immediate, more impossible to ignore. It needed a single summer, one summer so hot, so foul, so absolutely overwhelming in its sensory assault that the most powerful people on earth would finally be forced to act. Not tomorrow, not eventually, not after another generation had died. Now, that summer was coming, and it would arrive in 1858. But before we get there, I want to introduce you to one of the most overlooked figures in this entire story. A man whose name almost nobody knows, whose face appears on no statues, whose work done in the dark and the cold and the unbearable smell made every single city we have discussed more survivable than it would otherwise have been. The man who went down into the pits every night so that the rest of the city could sleep. Midnight. London. Sometime in the 1800s. The city is quiet in the way that a city of 2.5 million people is never truly quiet. There is always a cart somewhere, always a dog, always a baby crying 2 floors up, but the main streets are as empty as they get. The fog has come in off the Thames. The gas lamps make small yellow pools in the darkness. And somewhere in a residential street, a cart is rolling slowly to a stop. 4 men climb down. They carry lanterns and shovels and wooden barrels on poles. They move with the practiced efficiency. Ensign of people who do not waste motion, because they have until 5 in the morning. And there are cesspits to empty, and the clock does not care about their schedule. One of them rings a small bell not to wake anyone, not to announce themselves, but because this is the custom, a quiet signal in the dark, a warning to anyone who might look out a window and wonder what those shadows are doing in their backyard at this hour. The rope man affixes his lantern at the edge of the pit. The Holman descends, and the night soil men begin their work. Their full title in the historical record is a small masterpiece of Victorian euphemism. Night soil men. Night because that was the only time they were permitted to work. The law was clear and almost touchingly considerate. No waste collection after 5 in the morning or before 9 in the evening. The sight of carts piled with human excrement rolling through the streets was simply not acceptable to the daylight city. So the daylight city pretended successfully that it did not exist. Soil. Because the English language, confronted with something truly difficult, has always preferred to find a gentler word. The feces was called soil. The N who collected it were soil men. And somewhere in that soft-edged terminology, an entire civilization quietly arranged to keep its most essential workers at the very edge of visibility. Let me tell you who these men actually were. They were not a single category. Over the centuries, they went by different names in different eras. In medieval London, they were called rakers and gong firmers. The word gong came from the Old English gang, meaning to go slang for both the toilet and its contents. In the Tudor period, they were called gong farmers. By the Victorian era, they had become the night soil men, working in organized teams with specialized roles. And those roles had names, specific, functional names that tell you everything about the precision this work required. The team consisted of 4 men. The rope man stood at the edge of the pit. His job was to manage the tub a large wooden bucket on a rope, lowering it into the depths and pulling it back up when it was full. The Holman descended into the pit itself, down a ladder, into the dark, into the accumulated waste of an entire household, sometimes years' worth of it, compacted and solid at the bottom, the Holman scow. Oped waste into the tub, scraping the sides, working in the absence of any ventilation except the narrow opening above him. And 2 tubmen waited at the surface. When the rope man pulled up each full tub, the tubmen carried it to the cart on a pole slung between their shoulders. Stephen Johnson, in his essential book The Ghost Map about the 1854 cholera epidemic in London, describes this system with the precision it deserves. 4 men, 4 specific roles, a choreography worked out over generations of necessity. And it was standard practice, Johnson notes, for the night soil men to be offered a bottle of gin at each cesspit they cleared. One can understand why. Now, before we go further, I want to ask you something. When was the last time you thought about who empties the waste tanks at your local sewage treatment plant, or cleans the pipes beneath your street, or manages the treatment facility that processes what goes down your toilet this morning? I'm going to guess never, or almost never. And I think that is a profound and deeply human thing. We build elaborate systems to remove the consequences of our bodies from our awareness. And then, naturally, we stop thinking about those company and sequences. And then, eventually, we stop thinking about the people who manage them. The night soil men of London had the same problem. They were essential literally. The city could not function without the manned. They were invisible. They worked in darkness, specifically, so that the city could avoid looking at them. They were well paid, in relative terms. A gong farmer in the late 15th century could earn around 6 pence a day, which was roughly a week's wages for many unskilled labourers. By the Victorian era, a night soil man could earn 3 shillings a day, which was competitive for manual labour. But they were not invited to dinner. They were not welcomed in the pubs where their neighbours drank. They lived in designated areas of the city, because the smell that clung to them, no matter how thoroughly they washed, if they washed, marked them as apart. Here's a detail I find both darkly funny and genuinely moving. In medieval London, towards the end of the 14th century, there were exactly 16 public toilets for a population of 30,000 people. 16 for 30,000 people. And the job of keeping those 16 facilities, plus the private cesspits of all those thousands of households functioning, and not overflowing and not seeping through neighbours' walls, fell to the gong farmers. And one of those gong farmers in the year 1325 was a man named Richard the Raker. Richard was emptying a cesspit when the wooden floor, the old, rotting wooden cover that separated the working area above from the pit below, gave way beneath him. He fell in, and he drowned in a cesspit.
In the year 1325, his death is recorded in the historical documents. His name is preserved. Richard the Raker. A man who died doing the work that kept London alive in a way that nobody who has thought about it can ever quite forget. I think about Richard the Raker more than is probably entirely normal. I think about what his life was like, whether he had a family, whether they knew what he did for work, whether when he came home at 5 in the morning and the children asked where he had been, he answered directly or found a softer version. History does not record these things, but his death is there in the archive. One man's name, one man's end preserved, because it was unusual enough to be noted, even though his work was so ordinary, so routine, so constant that it was simply assumed. The only thing that made tea.
The record was that the system failed him. The floor rotted.
He fell. He drowned. What the record does not say what it does not need to say.
Because everyone at the time simply knew is that the night before he died, and the night before that, and every night for however long he had worked that job, Richard the Raker had been doing something essential. Without him, and men like him, the city would have choked on itself within weeks. Now, here's something about the night soil economy that I think is genuinely extraordinary, and that almost nobody talks about. The waste that the night soil men collected was not simply disposed of, it was sold. In medieval London, the gong farmers sold the night soil they collected to farmers outside the city walls. Human waste, collected, carted out through the city gates in the dark, and purchased by agricultural workers as fertilizer for the fields that fed the city back. A closed loop, waste out, food in. The city sustaining itself through its own excrement. in a cycle that, when you look at it squarely, is actually rather elegant. But here's the part that genuinely astonished me when I first encountered it. Some entrepreneurs working with the nitrogue, enriched compounds in human waste, discovered that they could extract a substance from the collected urine that had military applications. That substance was salt peripotassium nitrate, the key ingredient in gunpowder. So the waste that London's residents produced every night was not just feeding the city's agricultural hinterlands. It was, in a very real sense, contributing to the British Empire's capacity to wage war. The British Navy's gunpowder partly made from what Londoners flushed away each night. I want you to sit with that for a moment. The empire that ruled a quarter of the world's surface, the navy that kept the seas, the cannons that won the battles, all of them dependent, at least in part, on a supply chain that began in the cesspits of London and ended in a night soil man's cart rolling through the dark at 2 a.m. But here's the part of this story that I find most important, most worth sitting with, because by the mid-19th century, the night soil economy had broken down, not because the men disappeared, not because the work stopped being necessary, but because the city had grown so fast and a new technology had been introduced that the system, which had worked imperfectly for centuries, suddenly found itself overwhelmed. The new technology was the water closet, the flush toilet. The first working version had been installed in the late 16th century by a man named Sir John Harrington, who built one for his godmother, Queen Elizabeth. But it remained a curiosity for nearly 2 centuries. Then, in the 1770s and 1780s, 2 separate patents, one by a watchmaker named Alexander Cummings, one by a cabinet maker named Joseph Bramah, created a workable commercial design. And slowly, then quickly, flush toilets spread through the homes of those who could afford them. This sounds like progress. This sounds like exactly the kind of thing that should have solved the problem. And in one narrow sense, it did. The toilet moved the waste out of the house faster, more cleanly, more conveniently. The smell was reduced. The cesspit was replaced in many homes by a connection to the existing street drain. But here's the catastrophic flaw in the logic. The street drains did not lead to treatment facilities. They led to the Thames. So every flush toilet that was installed in London in the first half of the 19th century was very efficiently pumping human waste closely into the river that 2.5 million people also used as their primary source of drinking water. The night soil men, for all their limitations, had at least been moving the waste out of the city entirely. To farms, to fields, to dump sites beyond the walls. Imperfect, slow, never quite keeping pace, but directionally correct. The flush toilet, in the absence of a sewer system designed to actually process the waste it generated, made things worse. Significantly, measurably, lethally worse. And the night soil men, whose entire economy depended on collecting waste that people valued as fertilizer, found that their business was collapsing because waste flushed into the river had no market value. Nobody was paying for a bottle of gin and a cesspit cleaning if the option was simply to flush and let the problem flow downstream. According to historian Stephen Johnson, the elevated wages of the night soil men were already declining by the 1840s as the water closet spread. The waste that had once been sold as fertilizer and exchanged for gin was now simply gone down the drain into the river, where it would stay until the summer of 1858, when the river and the city and the world would all finally run out of patience at exactly the same moment. I want to close this part with something that I think is one of the most quietly powerful things in this entire story. Henry Mayhew, a Victorian journalist who spent years documenting the lives of London's working poor in his monumental work London Labour and The London Poor, interviewed night soil men. He talked to them. He wrote down what they said, and one of them, describing the work of clearing cesspits, told Mayhew this: "I should say that there's been a bottle of gin drunk at the clearing of every 2 and more than every 2 out of 3 cesspools emptied." That line has stayed with me for a long time. a bottle of gin at every 2 cesspits. Not because these men were drunks, but because the work was what it was, and the body has limits on what it can absorb without some form of buffer between the experience and the self. And Mayhew wrote it down. He recorded it. He treated these men as people worthy of documentation, worthy of quotation, worthy of a record that would survive them. In a city that had spent centuries arranging its entire physical and social infrastructure, specifically so it would not have to look at tea. These men, one journalist in the 1840s, stopped and looked and wrote their words down. And here, nearly 2 centuries later, we are reading them. I think that matters. I think the act of paying attention to the people who do the work that the world depends on but would rather not think about that act of attention is one of the most important things any civilization can do. The night soil men are long gone now. Their work survives in different form in the sewage treatment plants, and the underground networks, and the people who maintain them, whose names we also do not know, and whose work we also do not think about. But the chain, they were part of the long, messy, essential chain between human bodies, and a functioning city. That chain did not end with the flush toilet. It ran directly into the river. And in the summer of 1858, the river announced with considerable force that it had had enough. Long before it became an open sewer, the Thames was sacred. The Anglo-Saxons called it Thamesis, a name so ancient that its exact origins are still debated by linguists. Some trace it back to the pre-Roman Celtic people who lived along its banks, for whom the river was not just a source of water, but a boundary between worlds, a place where the living and the dead met, a conduit between the human and the divine. The Romans, when they arrived, built their city on its northern bank and called the settlement Landinium. The river made trade possible. It brought goods from across the empire. It fed the city, connected it to the wider world, and in the early centuries of the settlement's existence, it was clear enough that people drank from it, fished in it, bathed in it. When King John was forced to sign Magna Carta in 1215, he did so on an island in the Thames at Runnymede. The river was the backdrop for the founding document of English liberty. The Thames meant something, and then the city grew, and grew, and grew. By the year 1800, London's population had passed 1 million people. 1 million. To put that in context, at the height of medieval London's population before the Black Death, the city had perhaps 100,000 residents. In roughly 4.5 centuries of gradual growth, followed by 50 years of industrial explosion, London had multiplied its population tenfold, and that growth had a direction. It ran downhill into the river. By 1800, the cesspits installed in the aftermath of the Great Fire of 1666 were routinely overflowing. Developers building new streets added their own sewers, but with no central coordination, no unified plan, no authority governing where those sewers went. Some emptied into tributaries, some emptied into the streets, most following the path of least resistance, emptied into the Thames. And then, between 1800 and 1850, the population doubled again from 1 million to 2.5 million people, crammed into a city whose infrastructure had been designed, in its bones, for a medieval town of 30,000. More than 2 million people, all of them producing waste, all of it going somewhere. And that somewhere, increasingly, was the river. Here's a fact that I want you to hold very carefully, because it contains the central paradox of Victorian London. The Thames was both the city's sewer and its water supply. At the same moment that Londoners were flushing their waste into the river, or dumping it directly, or letting it overflow from cesspits into streets that drained into tributaries, that flowed into the Thames, they were also pumping that same water back up from the river through pipes into their homes, for drinking, for cooking, for washing the dishes their children ate from, the same water. I want you to sit with that for a moment. Not the horror of Itu, already feel the horror, but the strangeness of it, the sheer, astonishing cognitive disconnect involved in a civilization that simultaneously used the same body of water as both its primary toilet and its primary water source for decades, without fully connecting the dots between those two facts. How is that possible? The answer, as we have discussed throughout this story, is the miasma theory. If disease comes from bad air, not bad water, then the water is not the problem. The smell is. And the smell, you can try to escape. You can close your windows. You can burn fragrant herbs. You can move to a neighborhood where the stench is less severe. So the wealthy residents of London's fashionable West End, whose homes received water from companies that drew it upstream above the worst of the pollution, were accidentally, and unbeknownst to themselves, partially protected. Not because they understood the mechanism, but because their geography happened to put them upstream of the main sewage outflows. The poor residents of the East End, whose water came from companies that drew it downstream right in the middle of the sewage, were dying at rates that their neighbors in the West End simply could not imagine. The river was not killing everyone equally. It was killing the poor specifically, systematically, in ways that the wealthy could observe from a comfortable distance and attribute to the natural moral deficiencies of people who lived in dirty places. Now, let me tell you about a scientist named Michael Faraday, a man known primarily for his revolutionary work in electromagnetism. The person who discovered electromagnetic induction, whose experiments in his laboratory at the Royal Institution helped make the modern electrical world possible. In July of 1855, 3 years before the Great Stink, Michael Faraday took a boat trip down the Thames to investigate its condition firsthand. He dropped small pieces of white paper into the water as he went, watching them to test the river's visibility and turbidity. The papers disappeared the moment they touched the surface. Faraday wrote a letter to the Times newspaper, published on July 7, 1855. He described what he saw. The river was, in his words, an opaque, pale brown fluid. He wrote that near the bridges, the feculence rolled up in clouds so dense that they were visible at the surface. He noted that the smell was very bad the entire length of his journey. And then he wrote something that I find one of the most quietly devastating sentences in Victorian public discourse. If we neglect this subject, we cannot expect to do so with impunity. Michael Faraday, the man who understood electricity, standing in a boat on the Thames, watching white paper disappear into brown water, warning a city that it was running out of time. His letter was published. It was read. A cartoon appeared in the satirical magazine Punch the following week, showing Faraday handing his card to Father Thames, a grotesque figure rising from the filthy water with a caption about the dirty fellow.
And then nothing changed.
Because even the authority of the most celebrated scientist in England was not enough to move the machinery of government and money and political inertia that had allowed the problem to accumulate for decades. The letter was noted. The cartoon was amusing, and the Thames continued to receive, every single day, the waste of 2.5 million people. Let me tell you about a man whose death is one of the most poignant footnotes in the history of the Thames. His name was Prince Albert. You know him as Queen Victoria's husband, the German prince, who became the most powerful consort in British royal history. The man who organized the Great Exhibition of 1851, who championed science and industry and the arts, who designed the layout of what would become the museum district of South Kensington. The man who was, by all accounts, the driving intellectual force of the Victorian era's optimism about human progress. Prince Albert died in 1861. He was 42 years old. He died of typhoid fever. Typhoid fever, a disease transmitted by contaminated water. Historians have subsequently pointed to Windsor Castle, where Albert spent his final weeks, and its proximity to the Thames and its polluted tributaries. The castle's drainage ran into the same river that fouled London. The water tables mixed, and somewhere in that system, the one that was supposed to serve the most powerful household in the British Empire, the bacteria that killed him found its way in. The Queen's consort, dead of waterborne disease. carried by the same water that was killing the anonymous poor of Lambeth and Bermondsey and Shadwell every single week. Now, historians debate the exact cause. Some suggest typhoid, others have proposed typhus or stomach cancer or something else entirely. The medical records are incomplete, but the Times and the majority of contemporary accounts pointed to typhoid. And typhoid in 1861 London meant contaminated water, which meant the Thames. The Thames had reached the palace. By 1858, the river had received the waste of London for long enough that its chemistry had fundamentally changed. This
S is not a metaphor.
The Thames had literally become a different body of water from what it had been a century before. The oxygen levels had collapsed. Not enough remained to support the fish and invertebrates that had once made it a working fishing river. The salmon that had been plentiful in Tudor times were long gone. The last recorded salmon catch in the Thames, before the rivers near complete biological death, was in the 1820s. Industrial effluent from the tanneries and gasworks and chemical factories that lined the banks had added ammonia, cyanide, carbolic acid, and spent lime to the already overwhelming load of human waste. The river's temperature was unnaturally elevated from chemical reactions in the water. Charles Dickens, who understood Victorian London's underside better than almost anyone, had written in Little Dorrit published between 1855 and 1857, literally, on the eve of the great stinkabout, a deadly sewer that ebbed and flowed in the place of a fine, fresh river. Not metaphorical, observational. And then came the summer of 1858. I want to describe this summer to you with the specificity it deserves, because it was not just an unusually hot summer. T was a convergence of everything this city had been building toward for 5 centuries. London's population was 2.5 million people, making it the largest city in the world. The Thames, already strained to the limit, was receiving the direct waste of all those people through the sewers that the great sanitary reformer Edwin Chadwick had ironically helped create in the 1840s. Chadwick had believed wrongly but sincerely that the solution to disease was removing waste quickly. His reforms had accelerated the clearing of cesspits. The waste had flowed faster into the river. More contamination. More cholera. An example of good intentions, incomplete knowledge, and catastrophic results. And then in June of 1858, the temperature in the shade averaged between 34 and 36 degrees Celsius. In the sun, it reached 48 degrees. It barely rained. The water level in the Thames dropped. The sludge on the riverbank's years of accumulated waste baking in the sun, its fermentation accelerating as the temperature climbed, began to produce a smell that even contemporaries struggled to describe adequately. One witness wrote of an odor that seemed to speak aloud, stalking over the face of the Saucy. All the waters. The smell could reportedly be detected 13 kilometers away from the river. People vomited from the smell alone, not from disease, just from proximity to the air that rose from the Thames. One woman who attempted to drown herself in the river that summer was knocked unconscious by the toxic fumes before she could go under, and survived her suicide attempt as a direct result. And here's the piece of information that I think, more than any other, captures what made the Great Stink different from everything that had come before. The newly rebuilt Houses of Parliament sat directly on the riverbank. The members of Parliament, who had for decades debated various schemes for cleaning the Thames and then declined to fund them, who had read Faraday's letter and found it concerning but not urgent enough to act upon, who had watched cholera kill 30,000, 40,000, 50,000 Londoners and concluded repeatedly that the problem was not quite dire enough to require the expenditure of public funds. Those men were now sitting in their chambers with the windows closed in the middle of a heat wave. The curtains had been soaked in chloride of lime in an attempt to block the smell. They had been, instantaneously, driven from the library when they tried to work there. Benjamin Disraeli, speaking in the House of Commons, stood and declared the Thames a Stygian pool reeking with ineffable and intolerable horrors. Disraeli, the future Prime Minister, a man not noted for excessive sensitivity to the suffering of others, was using words like ineffable and intolerable. The government that had watched disease kill tens of thousands of its poorest citizens without sufficient urgency to act, that same government now found, quite suddenly, that it could not conduct its own business. The problem had become personal, and within 18 days, not years, not decades, but 18 days of Parliament, passed the legislation that would fund the greatest urban engineering project the world had ever seen. What does it say about us, about human beings in general, not just the Victorians, that we can watch a crisis harm strangers for decades without finding the will to act, and then mobilize with extraordinary speed the moment the same crisis inconveniences us personally? I don't ask that with judgment. I ask it with genuine curiosity, because it is not a Victorian failing. It is not a 19th century. URY failure of moral imagination. It is something much more consistent and much more deeply human than that. The Thames had been carrying disease to the poor of London since at least the 1830s. 4 cholera outbreaks. More than 100,000 deaths. A scientist of world renown had stood in a boat on the river and watched white paper disappear into brown water and warned them in the newspaper. And the bill took 18 days to pass. 18 days from unbearable personal inconvenience to legislative action. The distance between those two facts is the distance between sympathy and skin. The legislation passed, the money was allocated, and a man was waiting. A man who'd been waiting with plans already drawn, already refined, already doubled in safety margin, already designed down to the last angle and gradient and type of brick, for exactly this moment. His name was Joseph Bazalgette, and what he was about to build would change not just London, but every city on earth. June 1858, London. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert have decided to go for a pleasure cruise on the Thames. It's the kind of thing royalty does on a warm afternoon, a gentle trip along the most famous river in the most powerful. The city in the world, a chance to see the new buildings going up along the embankment, to enjoy the water and the light and the sense of a city at the peak of its imperial confidence. The royal barge pulls away from the dock, and within minutes, less than minutes, the Queen orders the boat turned around and brought back to shore immediately. Not because of weather, not because of politics, not because of any urgent matter of state. Because the smell is so overwhelming that even the most powerful couple in the world cannot remain on the water. Queen Victoria holds flowers to her face. Prince Albert turns away from the river. The boat docks again. And the summer of 1858 has its first victim. Let me tell you what was actually happening to the River Thames in that moment. Not the polite version, but the precise, documented, geological reality. By the summer of 1858, the riverbed of the Thames in central London had accumulated a layer of waste, human, animal, industrial that reached, in some sections, 9 feet deep. 9 feet. Deep enough to bury a man standing upright. This layer of accumulated filth had been building for decades. It was compressed and anaerobic, meaning it was breaking down. WN, in the absence of oxygen, in the way that produces the most volatile and toxic gases. Under normal conditions, the tidal action of the river kept this material churning, kept the worst of its chemistry moving, kept the concentration of gas below the threshold that made life intolerable. Then, the drought came. The summer of 1858 was described, in contemporary accounts, as one of the hottest in living memory. Temperatures in the shade averaged between 34 and 36 degrees Celsius. In direct sun, the temperature reached 48 degrees. The water level of the Thames dropped, and as it dropped, the 9-foot layer of compressed waste on the riverbanks was exposed to direct sunlight for the first time. The heat accelerated the fermentation. The gases that had been contained by the water were now rising freely into the air. The Illustrated London News published a piece in late June of 1858 that read, "We can colonize the remotest ends of the earth. We can conquer India. We can pay the interest of the most enormous debt ever contracted. We can spread our name and our fame and our fructifying wealth to every part of the world, but we cannot clean the River Thames, the most powerful empire on earth. Brought to its knees by its own waste. Now I want to walk you through the summer of 1858 almost day by day, because I think the specifics are what make this moment genuinely extraordinary. By June, the smell had become an acknowledged emergency. People living near the river reported being physically unable to walk along the embankment without vomiting. Those who worked on or near the watermen, the dock workers, the fishermen who had long since given up trying to catch anything in water that had become biological in its density, described being struck down by the fumes. The city tried to respond. At the peak of the crisis, 250 tons of lime were being spread along the banks of the Thames every single week. Men were employed in teams specifically to shovel lime onto the exposed riverbed, attempting to neutralize the chemistry of the fermentation. The cost was £1,500 per week, a significant sum. It did not work. The smell continued. Inside the Houses of Parliament, which had been rebuilt in the magnificent Gothic Revival style and completed just a few years earlier, sitting right on the northern bank of the Thames in what must have seemed, at the time of their design, like the finest possible location, conditions became extraordinary. The rooms on the river-facing side of the building were soaked in the smell. The library of the House of Lords, normally one of the most serene and prestigious working spaces in England, was described by the engineer responsible for the building's ventilation, Goldsworthy Gurney, as a stench trap. He declared formally to the Speaker that he could no longer be responsible for the health of the House. Members attempted to work. They tried soaking the curtains in chloride of lime, a disinfecting agent. The curtains were drenched. The smell came through anyway. Members ventured into the library to investigate the matter to its very depth, as the Times reported, with a trace of black humor, and were instantaneously driven to retreat, each man with a handkerchief to his nose. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, Benjamin Disraeli, entered a committee room. He left within seconds. A contemporary account in the Examiner described him walking out with a mass of papers in one hand and his pocket handkerchief applied to his nose, bent over, followed by the rest of the committee, all of them gagging. Think about what was happening. In this moment, the most powerful deliberative body in the most powerful nation on earth, the Parliament, that governed an empire spanning a quarter of the world's surface, driven from its own rooms by a smell. There were serious discussions about moving the entire machinery of government to Oxford, or to St. Albans, or to Henley-upon-Thames. Getting Parliament away from the river, away from the smell, away from what increasingly felt like a city becoming uninhabitable. Here's the detail from this summer that I find the most darkly magnificent. The same Parliament that was now gagging on the smell of the Thames had for decades been the body responsible for not acting on the sanitation problem. When Faraday had written his letter in 1855, dropping white paper into brown water, watching it disappear, warning them, the response had been essentially sympathetic concern and no action. When Dr. John Snow had published his waterborne theory of cholera in 1849, and then mapped 1854 Broad Street outbreak with near forensic precision and demonstrated that contaminated water, not bad air, was carrying the disease, the response from Parliament and the medical establishment had been essentially interesting but unproven. When the Times had run editorial after editorial about the state of the river, when Charles Dickens had written about it in his novels and in his journalism, when cholera had killed 6,000, then 14,000, then 10,000 Londoners in successive outbreaks, Parliament had passed resolutions, created committees, dissolved those committees, created new ones, argued about jurisdiction, argued about funding, argued about whose responsibility the river actually was. At one point, a member of Parliament stood in the House and said, "This is in the official record that the Thames had, by a perverse ingenuity, been changed into a cesspool."
and asked what the government intended to do about it.
The minister to whom the question was addressed replied that Her Majesty's government have nothing whatever to do with the state of the Thames.
Nothing whatever to do with it.
The government of the British Empire had nothing to do with the state of the river running through its capital city. That was the bureaucratic position maintained for decades, while people died by the tens of thousands. And then the smell reached the committee rooms. On the 15th of July, 1858, Benjamin Disraeli stood in the House of Commons and introduced the Metropolis Local Management Amendment Bill. He described the Thames in a speech preserved in the parliamentary record as a Stygian pool reeking with ineffable and intolerable horrors. The legislation passed in 18 days. 18 days from introduction to royal assent. Not years, not decades, not another committee, another inquiry, another resolution expressing concern. 18 days. The deaths of 40,000 people had not been enough to produce that speed. The letter of the greatest scientist in England had not been enough. The mapping of an epidemic by a visionary doctor had not been enough. The novels of the most widely read writer in the country had not been enough. But 18 days after politicians could no longer breathe in their own building, the bill was law. I want to pause here and notice something about ourselves. Not something critical, something honest. The people who sat in those committee rooms for decades and did not act were not monsters. They were not uniquely callous or uniquely self-interested compared to the people around them. Many of them genuinely believed the miasma theory, genuinely thought disease came from bad air rather than contaminated water, and had in their own way been trying to address the problem as they understood it. Edwin Chadwick, the great sanitary reformer, the man who had campaigned for decades to improve London's conditions, had genuinely believed that flushing waste away quickly would help. He was wrong about the mechanism, but he was not wrong about the urgency. The problem was not wickedness. The problem was the gap between what the crisis was doing to the people who needed solving it and what it was doing to the people with the power to solve it. When cholera killed in Lambeth, it killed poor people by the riverside, people who drank directly from the Thames, people who had no political leverage, people whose deaths could be and were attributed to their own moral deficiencies, their own failure to live more hygienically, their own poverty. The wealthy residents of the West End, drawing water from upstream, could observe the crisis from a comfortable distance. The moment the crisis became a physical sensation that could not be escaped by wealth or distance, the moment it walked through the walls of Parliament on the river breezed the political Wilmoturi. Alysed in 18 days. That is not a Victorian failing. That is a human one. And the gap between the moment you understand that something is wrong and the moment you personally feel the consequences, that gap has determined the timing of almost every great reform in human history. Now, the immediate instinct of the government before Disraeli's bill during the acute phase of the smell was to treat the symptom rather than the cause. 250 tons of lime per week on the riverbanks, chloride of lime on the curtains, carbolic acid poured into the sewer outfalls. The stench was the perceived enemy, and they attacked it directly. This is important to understand, because it illustrates one final time the profound difference between addressing a problem and addressing its perception. The smell was not the problem. The smell was the information, the river's way of communicating, with brutal clarity, that something had gone catastrophically wrong. By trying to mask the smell with lime and carbolic acid, the initial response was, in effect, trying to switch off the alarm without addressing the fire. The fire, of course, was 250 tons of fecal matter entering the Thames every single day. 250 tons T. Hat number from the Royal Museum's Greenwich records is not a metaphor. By 1857, before the Great Stink had even reached its peak, the Thames was receiving that quantity of human waste every single day from the 2.5 million residents of the city, through the sewers, through the streets, through the tributaries, every single day. The lime cost £1,500 a week and accomplished nothing except allowing people to walk slightly closer to the river before they were overwhelmed. And then the bill passed, and the money was released. And a man who'd been working on this problem for years, quietly, methodically, without fame or recognition, drawing plans and revising them and refining them, was finally told that he could build what he had been designing all along. His name was Joseph Bazalgette, and he was the chief engineer of the Metropolitan Board of Works. And the plan he'd been sitting on, waiting for exactly this moment, was the most ambitious urban engineering project in the history of the world. But before I tell you what he built, because what he built is extraordinary and deserves its own space, its own care, its own appreciation, I want to ask you one more question about this MoME. NT. Not about London, not about the Thames, about us. Think about the problems we know about right now. The things that scientists have warned us about. The things that journalists have documented. The things that the people who are closest to the consequences understand with absolute clarity, while those with the power to act observe from a comfortable distance, express concern, form committees, and find reasons why the time is not quite right. What will our version of the 1858 summer look like? When does the smell reach the committee rooms? While Parliament was debating the smell and Benjamin Disraeli was fleeing committee rooms with his handkerchief pressed to his face, a very different kind of battle had been playing out in the streets of London. A quieter battle fought not with money or legislation, but with a notebook, a set of interviews, and a map. A battle between two ideas about how the world works. And the person at the center of it had been dead for 16 years by the time anyone admitted he had been right. This is the story of Dr. John Snow, and I want to tell it properly, because the popular version, the neat, triumphant version, where the clever doctor removes the PU, MP handle, and saves the neighborhoodies, both true and somewhat misleading. The real story is messier, stranger, more frustrating, and, in the end, more moving than the legend. John Snow was born in the city of York in the north of England in 1813, the first of 9 children, born to a coal laborer and his wife. He had the particular kind of determination that sometimes emerges from working class families, a ferocious commitment to the life of the mind in the absence of any inherited advantage. He qualified as a physician and eventually settled in Soho, the same neighborhood where, some years later, he would conduct the investigation that would make him famous. But before the cholera investigation, he was already one of the most celebrated doctors in England for a completely different reason. John Snow was one of the pioneers of anesthesia. He developed the protocols for administering ether and chloroform safely, designed the apparatus to administer them, and became so trusted in this work that Queen Victoria personally requested his services during the births of her last 2 children. Think about that for a moment. The man who would map a cholera outbreak and challenge the medical experts. Establishment's most fundamental assumptions about disease, this man was also the person Queen Victoria trusted to administer anesthesia when she gave birth. He was not a crank. He was not a radical. He was the establishment's own doctor, trusted with the Queen's welfare. And he used that credibility and that meticulous scientific methodology to argue for something that the establishment found deeply inconvenient. The prevailing theory of disease in Victorian England, the miasma theory, which we've discussed throughout this story, held that illness came from bad air, from the foul emanations of decaying organic matter, from the smell. This theory was not held by ignorant people. It was held by some of the most brilliant minds of the century. Edwin Chadwick, the great sanitary reformer, believed in it so deeply that he had structured his entire career around it. Florence Nightingale believed in it. William Farr, the most sophisticated medical statistician in England, a man whose data-gathering abilities were genuinely extraordinary, believed in it. The theory made intuitive sense. Disease did tend to concentrate in areas that smelled bad. Areas with poor sanitation did have higher mortality.
The correlation was real. The causal mechanism was wrong.
John Snow had been skeptical of the miasma theory since at least 1849, when he published an essay titled On the Mode of Communication of Cholera. In that essay, he argued, without yet having conclusive proof, that cholera was transmitted not through the air, but through contaminated water, through the fecal-oral route. The essay was read, it was considered, and it was rejected. The medical establishment returned to their miasma. Then, on the 31st of August 1854, cholera struck the Soho district of London with extraordinary speed. 500 people died within 10 days. 500 people in 10 days in a radius of a few city blocks. Snow lived in Soho. His practice was there. He saw what was happening from the beginning, and he began to investigate immediately. Not with a laboratory, not with microscopes or bacterial cultures, none of that technology existed yet, but with what he did have. A methodical, almost obsessive ability to talk to people and then think carefully about what they told him. He went door to door. He talked to families. He asked the same questions over and over. What water did you drink? Which pee did you use? Did any family member use a different source? And he began to build a map. Each death was marked as a black bar on the map of the neighborhood. The bars clustered. They concentrated. And when he looked at the cluster, the pattern was undeniable. Every death, or nearly every death, pointed toward one location: the public water pump on Broad Street, now Broadwick Street, in the heart of Soho. Now, here's where the story gets genuinely fascinating, because a lesser scientist would have stopped there, would have said, the deaths cluster around the pump, therefore the pump is the cause. But Snow was more careful than that, because there were anomalies. There was, for instance, a workhouse on Poland Street, right in the middle of the outbreak zone. Over 500 people lived there, yet almost none of them died of cholera. If the Broad Street pump was the source, why had the workhouse been spared? Snow went to investigate. He discovered that the workhouse had its own private well. The residents drank from a different source. They had not touched the Broad Street pump. There was also the Lion Brewery, a workplace directly on Broad Street in the epicenter of the outbreak. 70 workers, no cholera deaths. Snow went to the brewery. He discovered that the brewery workers, whether by habit or by preference or simply by the practical logic of their occupation, did not drink water. They drank beer all day, every day. The brewery provided beer to its workers in lieu of water. And because they never drank from the Broad Street pump, the 70 brewery workers were entirely untouched by an epidemic that was killing their neighbors within walking distance of where they worked. There was also the case of a woman who had moved away from Soho years before, lived in a completely different part of London, but was found dead of cholera. Her son told Snow that she had previously lived on Broad Street and had developed such a strong preference for the taste of that particular pump's water that she had arranged to have it delivered to her new home. She had died drinking water from a pump 13 kilometers away because she liked the taste. Snow's investigation was so thorough, so specific, so attentive to individual human detail that it went beyond establishing statistical correlation. It established story. It found the human connections, the brewery workers who drank beer, the workhouse with its own well, the woman who loved the taste of Broad Street water, that together made the case not just mathematically, but humanly comprehensible. He brought his findings to the Board of Guardians of St. James Parish. He presented the evidence. He asked for the pump handle to be removed. They were doubtful. They were skeptical. The miasma theory was the consensus, and the medical establishment does not abandon consensus easily, as a rule. But Snow pressed. He was persistent. He was specific. And on September the 7th, 1854, the board agreed to remove the pump handle. The outbreak, which had already begun to subside as the population fled the neighborhood, slowed and stopped within a few days. Snow wrote to the Medical Times and Gazette. The number of attacks of cholera had been diminished before this measure were adopted, but whether they had diminished in a greater proportion than might be accounted for by the flight of the great bulk of the population, I am unable to say. He was being rigorously, almost maddeningly honest. Even in his moment of apparent vindication, he was careful not to claim more certainty than the evidence supported. And then came the officia.
Response. The Board of Health investigated. They studied the data.
And they concluded, in their official report, that the cause of the outbreak was miasma. I want to quote their conclusion directly, because it is one of the most extraordinary sentences in the history of public health. After careful inquiry, we see no reason to adopt this belief that the choleic infection multiplies rather in air than in water. The committee had looked at Snow's evidence and concluded bad air. Now, here's the part of this story that I find most important to understand and that most retellings rush past. Why was the miasma theory so hard to abandon? Not stupidity.
Not malice. Something more interesting. The theory was partially correct in its observations, while being entirely wrong in its mechanism.
Places that smelled bad really did have higher disease rates. The correlation was real. The causal direction was backward. The smell was a symptom of the same conditions that caused the disease: contaminated water, accumulated waste, not the cause of the disease itself. But the correlation was genuine. And here's the deeper problem. If you accept the germ theory, if you accept that disease spreads through contaminated water, via the fecal-oral route, which is a slightly more explicit way of saying that people are getting sick because they are inadvertently consuming their neighbor's excrement, then you have accepted something that Victorian society found almost physically unacceptable. It was, as the Wikipedia article on the Broad Street outbreak notes, that accepting Snow's theory meant indirectly accepting the fecal-oral route of disease transmission, which was too unpleasant for most of the public to contemplate. The theory was uncomfortable. Not metaphorically uncomfortable. Literally, physically, viscerally uncomfortable, in a way that made intelligent people who encountered it find reasons to doubt it rather than accept its implications. Sometimes the barrier to truth is not ignorance. Sometimes it is the difficulty of sitting with an uncomfortable conclusion. John Snow continued his work after Broad Street. He conducted a massive statistical study comparing mortality rates in neighborhoods served by different water companies. The Southwark and Vauxhall Company, which drew its water from a heavily contaminated section of the Thames, and the Lambeth Company, which had VED, its intake upstream to cleaner water. What he found was a natural experiment on a scale that no laboratory could have replicated. Households served by the Southwark and Vauxhall Company, the one drawing from the polluted Thames, were dying of cholera at a rate almost 5 times higher than households served by the Lambeth Company. Same streets, same neighborhoods. The only difference was which pipe the water came from. Snow published this in 1855 in a second edition of his cholera essay. It was the most comprehensive epidemiological study in the history of the discipline up to that point. And still, the medical establishment maintained the miasma theory. Dr. William Farr, the great statistician, the man with more relevant data than almost anyone in England, analyzed Snow's findings and found a different explanation. Farr believed that altitude was the protective factor. Lower elevation areas had more disease, he argued, because miasmatic vapors collected in low-lying areas. He was right that low elevation areas had more disease. He was wrong about why. John Snow died on June 16, 1858. He was 45 years old. He had suffered a stroke while working at his practice on the 10th of June and died 6 days later. And here's the detail that I cannot think about without a kind of deep sadness. He died in June of 1858, the great stink, the summer that would finally force Parliament to act, the summer that would ultimately lead to the construction of Basel jets, sewers. The system that would confirm Snow's theory by virtue of working had already begun. The stench was already rising from the Thames. Parliament would begin its desperate curtain-soaking measures within weeks. And the man who had understood, with more clarity than almost anyone alive, exactly what the problem was and how to fix it, he was gone. He never knew that Parliament would act. He never knew that Bazalgette would build the sewers. He never lived to see the cholera outbreaks end. He never heard William Farr, his great opponent, finally admit in 1866 that water, not air, was the vector that Snow had been right all along. He never read the correction that the Lancet printed in 2013 to 155 years after his bear, acknowledging that its original obituary of Snow had failed to recognize his achievements. Here's what I keep coming back to. John Snow had the right answer. He had it in 1849, 5 years before Broad Street, 9 years before the Great Stink. He had done the work. He had gathered the data. He had mapped the deaths and interviewed the families and found the brewery workers who drank beer and the woman who liked the taste of Broad Street water. He had built the most comprehensive case that could be built with the tools that were available and presented it clearly, and been ignored for 17 years. And then he died. And then slowly, the world caught up to what he'd already known. I think about that whenever I encounter someone who is doing the work, gathering the data, making the case, presenting the evidence clearly, and being ignored, not because they're wrong, but because what they're right about is inconvenient or uncomfortable or challenges something that powerful people have built their understanding of the world around. John Snow's story is not just a story about cholera. It is a story about the specific courage required to maintain a correct answer in the face of institutional rejection. The courage of patience, the courage of precision, the courage to keep adding data to a case that the people with power are determined not to accept. And it is a story about the gap between truth and acceptance, the sometimes enormous distance between the moment when someone gets something right and the moment when the world acknowledges it. There is a pub on Broadwick Street in London today, the street that was once Broad Street. It stands near the spot where the famous pump once was. A replica handle marks the location. The pub is called the John Snow. It is, I think, a fitting memorial. Not a statue in Parliament Square, not a name on a grand building, a neighborhood pub on a Soho street. Near the pump he identified, in the community he walked through, asking questions in September of 1854. If you're ever in London, go via drink at the John Snow. Think about the man who lived and worked on that street, who understood something essential about disease and water and cities, while the world around him argued about bad air. And raise a glass to the brewery workers who drank beer instead. They had the right idea all along. The sewers were being built. The cholera would end. The understanding that Snow had dedicated his life to establishing would eventually reshape public health worldwide. But the building itself, the actual engineering, the actual digging, the actual construction of the system that would make it all possible, that is a story of its own. A story of a man with plans already drawn, waiting for exactly this moment, who built something so far-sighted that it is still working today. That story is where we go next. There's a memorial on the Thames Embankment in London. It is not large. It does not dominate its surroundings, the way monuments to kings and generals tend to do. It is a modest stone arch set into the wall near Hungerford Bridge, with a bronze bust and a Latin inscription above it. The inscription reads, Flumen vinculis passut, he put the river in chains. And beneath it, the name. Sir Joseph William Bazalgette. Most visitors to London walk past it without stopping. Most people who live in London have never read it. The man it commemorates is not a household name in the way that the generals and monarchs and poets who crowd the Sicky's statues and street names tend to be. And yet, historian after historian, engineer after engineer, public health expert after public health expert has concluded the same thing. Joseph Bazalgette almost certainly saved more lives than any other Victorian official, possibly more than any single person in the history of the city. And he did it by building a very large drain. Let's start with who this man actually was, because the biographical details are, I think, genuinely surprising. Joseph Bazalgette was born in 1819 in Enfield, in North London. His family were of French Huguenot descent Protestant refugees who'd come to England from France in the late 17th century, escaping religious persecution. His father was a Royal Navy captain who'd been wounded in the Napoleonic Wars. As a young man, Bazalgette worked as a railway engineer, learning his craft on the massive engineering projects that were reshaping the British landscape in the 1830s and 40s. He worked on land drainage in Ireland, on railway lines across Britain, on the kinds of large-scale infrastructure projects that the Victorian era generated in extraordinary abundance. And then, in 1849, he applied for a position with the Metropolitan Commission of Sewers, the body responsible for London's drainage. He had just returned from a period of recovery in the countryside, having suffered what contemporaries described as a complete physical breakdown from the intensity of his previous work. He was 30 years old. He'd been pushing himself to the absolute limits of human endurance. And he had come back to London to find the city in the grip of its second cholera epidemic. 14,137 people died. He took the job. For the next 9 years, from 1849 to 1858, Bazalgette watched plan after plan get drawn up, debated, rejected, revised, debated again, and shelved. The Metropolitan Commission of Sewers went through 7 iterations. It was dissolved and replaced. Each new body received his proposals and found reasons to hesitate. The technical merits of different approaches were debated endlessly. The question of where the outfalls should be placed, how far downstream, and how the cost should be allocated between North and South London, who had jurisdiction over what stretch of the river consumed committee meeting after committee meeting. A cholera epidemic in 1853 killed 10,738 more people, and still the committees met, and still Bazalgette drew plans. The BBC documentary, that included a segment on his work, noted that Bazalgette drove himself to the limits in realizing his subterranean dream. The historical records of the project contain thousands of plans with his handwritten notes. Approved, JWB. I do not like 6 in used here. 9 in should be used, JWB. The handwriting of a man personally checking every connection in a system that would eventually span thousands of miles. He was not waiting for inspiration. He already had the design. He was waiting for permission. The permission came in 1858, 18 days after Benjamin Disraeli introduced the bill. 18 days after Parliament could no longer breathe in its own building. And Bazalgette had been ready for years. The plan he had was both breathtakingly ambitious and, in its essential logic, almost elegant in its simplicity. London's existing sewers, and there were many of them, a chaotic, coordinated network of tunnels and pipes and covered rivers, built over centuries, all had the same flaw. They ran toward the Thames. They emptied into the Thames. And the Thames, being a tidal river, did not carry the waste away. It carried it back upstream, downstream, back and forth, with the tides accumulating rather than dispersing. Bazalgette's insight was to intercept this system rather than replace it. Instead of tearing out the entire existing network and starting from scratch, which would have been impossibly disruptive and impossibly expensive, he would build a series of new, large underground tunnels running parallel to the Thames at different levels to catch different grades of existing flow. These intercepting sewers would collect everything from the existing system and carry it eastward, far eastward, downstream past the populated heart of the city to outfall points where the waste could be released into the river on the ebb tide, letting the natural movement of the water carry it out to sea. The existing sewers, instead of emptying into the river in the middle of the city, would now empty into Bazalgette's interceptors. The interceptors would carry everything east. The river. In central London would be spared. Gravity would do most of the work. Where the terrain did not allow for a natural fall, massive pumping stations would provide the mechanical force. Simple, audacious, technically demanding in the extreme. Now, let me tell you about the numbers, because the numbers in this case are the whole story. The project required the construction of 82 miles of main intercepting sewers, 1,100 miles of street sewers, to feed them. To build those tunnels, workers excavated 3.5 million cubic yards of earth. They laid 318 million bricks, 318 million held in place by 1 million cubic yards of cement. The demand for skilled bricklayers was so high that it drove their wages up by 20%, significant labour market disruption, at a time when Victorian England had no shortage of construction work already underway. The project took from 1859, when ground was broken, to 1875, when the final sections were completed. 16 years of continuous construction beneath one of the world's most densely populated cities, while that city continued to function above it. Queen Victoria officially opened the Northern Outfall Sewer in 1865 at a ceremony at the Abbey Mills Pumping Station A. Magnificent Victorian Gothic structure designed in deliberate contrast to the utilitarian work it performed, with ornate ironwork and cathedral-like proportions. One does not ordinarily celebrate a sewage pumping station with a royal opening ceremony. But Bazalgette and the Metropolitan Board of Works understood something important. This was not just infrastructure. This was a statement about what a civilization owed to its people. The cement. I want to spend a moment on the cement, because the choice Bazalgette made here is one of the most interesting technical decisions in the history of civil engineering. The standard cement available in Britain at the time was called Roman cement, a reasonably effective material, but one with a critical flaw. It was not fully waterproof, and it tended not to achieve permanent hardness. For building a sewer structure that would spend its entire existence immersed in water under pressure, handling the waste of millions Roman cement was not good enough. Bazalgette chose Portland cement instead. Portland cement had been patented in 1824 by a Yorkshire bricklayer named Joseph Aspdin, but it had been adopted very slowly by the construction industry. Why? Partly because it required extremely precise mixing. The balance of limestone, clay, and water had to be exact. If the proportions were off, the cement lost most of its strength. Most engineers found it too risky for large-scale work. Bazalgette didn't just use Portland cement. He took control of the quality problem himself. He developed a rigorous testing procedure for every batch of cement delivered to the project. His staff tested samples at regular intervals and rejected any batch that didn't meet the specified standards. He introduced quality control to a construction process that, before his insistence, had largely relied on the judgment and honesty of individual suppliers. This was not just good engineering, it was good management. It was a systematic approach to quality that, in the context of Victorian construction, was genuinely innovative. And the result? Those tunnels are still in use. A structure built in the 1860s, using cement that had only existed as a commercial product for 40 years at the time, is still handling the sewage of one of the world's great cities in the 21st century. The Institution of Civil Engineers, in their assessment of Bazalgette's legacy, page UTTT directly. If Bazalgette had used the smaller pipe diameter, the city's sewers would have overflowed in the 1960s. Instead, they've coped into the 21st century. Which brings us to what I consider the single most extraordinary engineering decision in this entire story: the diameter of the pipes. Bazalgette had a problem that every infrastructure planner faces when designing for the future. He didn't know exactly how much the city would grow or how much waste that growth would generate. His approach was methodical. He took the most densely populated areas of London. He estimated the daily waste production per person, and he did this generously, assuming more waste per person than the averages would have suggested. He calculated the total flow that his interceptors would need to handle. He arrived at a number, and then he doubled it, just doubled it. His explanation, preserved in the institutional records of the time, was simple. We're only going to do this once, and there's always the unforeseen. 9 words. 9 words that contain perhaps the most important principle in all of long-term engineering. when you are building something that will be very expensive to fix later. A. ND. That serves a fundamental human need. Do not optimize for current requirements. Build for what you cannot yet predict. The unforeseen, in Bazalgette's case, turned out to be high-rise buildings and the mid-20th century population boom they enabled. Without his double-diameter decision, the system would have overflowed sometime in the 1960s, at a point when London's population had grown in ways that nobody in 1859 could have reliably foreseen. It didn't overflow. It kept working. It is working right now, as you listen to this, somewhere under the streets of London. But here's the part that I think reveals the full measure of this man's achievement. The part that goes beyond the engineering itself. Bazalgette's sewers were built on the wrong scientific premise. The Victorian establishment believed that disease came from bad air miasma, not from contaminated water. The entire public health argument for building the sewers was based on miasma theory. Remove the stench from the Thames, remove the bad air, reduce the disease. John Snow was right that the mechanism was waterborne. The miasmatists were wrong. And yet, the sewers worked anyway, because by intercepting the sewage before T reached the river and carrying it far downstream before releasing it, Bazalgette's system removed the waste from the water supply, regardless of whether the person authorizing the project understood why that mattered. The miasma believers funded a project to reduce bad smells. The project reduced bad smells and eliminated the bacterial contamination of the water supply, and eliminated cholera, and saved an estimated hundreds of thousands of lives over the following decades. The right action for the wrong reason. And this is the detail I keep returning to when I think about this story. How many of the right decisions in human history have been made for wrong reasons? How many times has a civilization inadvertently stumbled into the correct answer through a combination of good engineering, fortunate timing, and flawed understanding? Bazalgette didn't know he was implementing Snow's theory. Snow was barely acknowledged as having had a theory worth implementing, and yet the system they had built together, one unknowingly, one posthumously, worked. The last cholera epidemic in London struck in 1866. It was confined to a single area of the East Ender area that had not yet been connected to Bazalgette's new sewer system. Every other part of London, now connected to the interceptors, was spared. The epidemic was the final proof, the geographic proof, the epidemiological proof of everything Snow had argued. The disease concentrated exactly where the new sewers had not yet reached, and nowhere else. William Farr, who had spent his career defending the miasma theory, looked at the data from the 1866 outbreak and could no longer deny what it showed. He converted. He accepted Snow's theory. He wrote a monograph acknowledging the waterborne mechanism 8 years after Snow died. 8 years after Snow had been unable to see this moment coming. Let me tell you what Bazalgette built above the ground too, because the sewers were only part of the story. To carry his northern intercepting sewer along the north bank of the Thames, Bazalgette needed to embank the river to push the shoreline outward, reclaiming land from the water, creating a new embankment on which the road and the sewer tunnel and eventually the underground railway would all run together. The Victoria Embankment, completed in 1870. The Albert Embankment on the south side. The Chelsea Embankment further up street. 22 acres of new land created from the river. The broad, tree-lined promenades along the Thames that Londoners and tourists enjoy today. The avenues of plane trees, the gardens, the benches, with views of the water, these exist because of Bazalgette. The tunnels beneath them, the district and circle lines of the London Underground, running alongside the sewers, these exist because of Bazalgette. He also rebuilt 3 of London's bridges: Battersea, Hammersmith, and Putney when they were found to be structurally inadequate. He designed the free Woolwich ferry service. He laid out large sections of the road network that is still used today. The historian Peter Ackroyd wrote that Bazalgette should be considered a hero of London. The BBC named the London sewer system one of the 7 wonders of the industrial world. And yet, As the London Historian's website puts it, for one who made such an impact on the topography of our city and the health of its citizens, this Victorian engineer remains relatively obscure to the public at large. Why? I think the answer lies in the nature of what he built. War's produce, visible heroes. Novels' produce, celebrated authors. Political victories produce famous orators. Even scientific discoveries, once accepted, produce named theories and Nobel Prizes and bust portraits in institutions. But infrastructure, the tunnels under the city, the invisible systems that keep millions of people alive every day, without any of them needing to know how it works. Those produce a modest stone arch on the Thames embankment that most visitors walk past without stopping. Sir Christopher Wren, the architect of St. Paul's Cathedral, was buried in the crypt of the cathedral he designed, with an epitaph that has become one of the most famous in the English language. Lector, si monumentum requiris, circumspes reader, if you seek his monument, look around you. The same epitaph has been applied by more than one London historian to Joseph Bazalgette. If you seek his monument, if you want to understand what one person, working methodically over decades with absolute commitment to getting the details right, can contribute to the welfare of millions of people who will never know his name, look around you. Or, more precisely, look under you, because the monument is there, in the dark, carrying the waste of a city that is still alive, because he built. One more thing before we move to the final chapter of this story. Something I find both humbling and deeply hopeful. The system that Bazalgette built, the system that was designed for 2.5 million people, doubled in capacity for the unforeseen, and still working for nearly 9 million people today. That system is finally reaching its limits. London is building a new sewer, the Thames Tideway Tunnel, 25 kilometers long, running 30 to 60 meters below the river. Projected completion in the mid-2020s, estimated cost over £4 billion, and the company contracted to build it is named Bazalgette Tunnel Limited. The best compliment the 21st century could pay to the 19th. We have followed this story from the filth of medieval London to the engineering miracle that cleaned it up. We've watched civilizations forget what Rome knew and cities grow faster than anyone could manage and plague feed on the gap between what people needed and what they had. We have watched a parliament flee its own building, a scientist die before his ideas were accepted, and an engineer double his pipe diameters because there's always the unforeseen. And now, in our final part, RT, I want to do something different. I want to step back from the past entirely and ask, what did all of this cost? And what does it mean for where we are right now? Because the story of London's filth, the 500-year struggle from medieval cesspits to Victorian sewers, is not just a story about the past. It is a mirror. And in that mirror, if we look carefully enough, we can see the present and we can see ourselves. We've been telling a story about London. But we've actually been telling a story about something much larger than London. Let me show you what I mean. In the summer of 1892, 1 year after Joseph Bazalgette died, the city of Hamburg was struck by a cholera epidemic. In 6 weeks, it killed more than 8,000 people. The outbreak was one of the most lethal in European history up to that point. London, which had been Hamburg's close trading partner for centuries, with ships moving constantly between the two ports, people traveling, goods exchanging hands, have been devastated too. It was not one significant epidemic outbreak reached London because Bazalgette's system was there. Because the pipes and the tunnels and the embankments and the pumping stations had done the job. Because one man working methodically over 16 years had built something so well, with such extraordinary foresight, that it continued protecting people decades after his death, even from a disease arriving from one of their closest trading partners. The system outlived its creator by more than a century and a half so far, and counting. Now, I want to pause here and do something that this kind of story doesn't often do. I want to say thank you. Not in an abstract way, not as a rhetorical flourish. I mean, the next time you use a bathroom, and the waste disappears when you flush and you don't think twice about it. Someone built that. Someone spent years planning it, arguing for funding, overcoming resistance, checking every connection, writing. I do not like six in used here, in the margins of thousands of engineering documents. Someone decided that you deserved not to think about it. That is not nothing. That is one of the most profound acts of civic generosity in human history, the creation of systems so complete, so reliable, so well designed that the people they serve can live their entire lives without ever needing to understand how they work. It is a gift given by the past to the future. And most of us, most days, receive that gift in total ignorance of where it came from. But here's the thing that keeps me up at night when I think about this story. We received the gift, and we accepted it gladly, and we built our lives on top of it. And in doing so, in making clean water and functioning sewers so normal, so invisible, so completely assumed, we have also, without realizing it, stopped being able to imagine life without them. Which makes us almost precisely like the medieval Londoners who could not imagine life with them. Different direction, same structure of assumption. And I want to give you a number that I think makes this point with the kind of precision that only lived reality can provide. In 2024, according to the World Health Organization and UNICEF most recent joint monitoring program report released in August of 2025, 3.44 billion people on this planet did not have safely managed sanitation services. 3.44 billion. That is not a historical figure. That is not a number from medieval London or Victorian England. That is the world right now. 3.44 billion people, nearly half the global population, living without the thing that we spent 11 parts of this story explaining is the single most foundational requirement for human health in an urban environment. 354 million of them are still practicing open defecation in fields, in rivers, in places that feed directly into the water supplies that other people drink. The cities of medieval Europe were not uniquely wicked or stupid for having this problem. They were just large, growing, and under-equipped. And right now, in cities across sub-Saharan Africa, across South and Southeast Asia, across parts of Latin America cities, with millions of residents, cities growing faster than any medieval city ever did, cities with the ambition and the energy and the intelligence of any city that has ever existed, the same fundamental gap is playing out. The infrastructure is not keeping pace with the population. The rules exist, the understanding exists, the will, in some places, briefly exists. But the systems, the permanent, maintained, scaled-up physical systems that actually separate waste from water, those are not there yet for billions of people. This is not a guilt trip. I want to be honest about that. I am not going to tell you that knowing this fact obligates you to do any particular thing. That is your decision, made in the context of your own life and your own values and your own sense of what is possible. But I do want to tell you what I think this history means, because I think the lesson of London is not simply build better sewers. That is the engineering lesson, but the human lesson, the one that cuts underneath the pipes and the bricks and the pricks and the planning committees, something more difficult. The lesson is about the relationship between visibility and urgency. London had a sanitation crisis for 500 years before it solved it. Not because the problem was secret, not because no one understood it, but because the people who suffered most from it had the least power to force a solution. And the people with the most power to force a solution suffered least from it. The poor of Lambeth and Bermondsey died of cholera at rates 5 times higher than the wealthy residents of the West End. That is not a metaphor. That is a documented historical fact from John Snow's own statistics. And the political will to act materialized in 18 days when the smell finally reached the committee rooms, when the problem became personal. Now think about those 3.44 billion people. Lou, Think about the committee rooms of the modern world, the international institutions, the development banks, the donor governments, the policy forums, and ask yourself, honestly, has the smell reached their committee rooms yet? I want to give you one more story before we close. In 2023, the city of Kathmandu in Nepal held one of the most important water and sanitation summits in recent years. Representatives from more than 20 countries gathered, engineers, public health officials, government ministers, to discuss the gap between where the world is and where it needs to be. The WHO and UNICEF report was stark. To achieve universal, safely managed sanitation by the year 2030, the target set by the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the world would need to increase the current pace of progress by 5 times. 5 times. Not improve incrementally, not continue at the current rate with some additional effort, 5 times faster. That is the scale of the challenge. That is the gap between the world we have built for ourselves in cities like London and Paris and New York, and the world that exists for the majority of humanity. And here's what I keep returning to when I think about that number. In 1858, London faced a problem that had been building for 500 years. The technical solution had been understood in outline for decades. The political will was absent until the summer made it impossible to ignore any longer. And then, in 18 days, the bill passed. 18 days. The problem did not become solvable in 18 days. It had been solvable for a long time. What changed in 18 days was not the technology, not the knowledge, not the engineering capability. What changed was the motivation of the people with the power to act. There is a quote that I have come back to again and again while thinking about this story. It comes from the Illustrated London News, published on June 26, 1858, right in the middle of the Great Stink. The editorial board wrote, "We can colonize the remotest ends of the earth. We can conquer India. We can pay the interest of the most enormous debt ever contracted. We can spread our name and our fame and our fructifying wealth to every part of the world, but we cannot clean the River Thames." What they were expressing, in that moment of frustrated self-awareness, was the gap between a civilization's ambitions and its willingness to do the unsexy, expensive, unglamorous work of maintaining the systems that made all that ambition possible. They could conquer India. They could not clean the river. We live in a world that can send missions to Mars, that can sequence genomes, that can build artificial intelligence systems that write poetry and diagnose diseases. And 3.44 billion people do not have safely managed sanitation. I am not asking you to feel guilty about this. I am asking you to feel the weight of it. Because the gap between what humanity can do and what humanity has done for the most fundamental human needs of the majority of its members, that gap is not a technical problem. It is a problem of visibility and urgency, and the distance between the committee rooms and the consequences. It is, in that sense, the same problem that London had for 500 years. Let me bring this home. You're here tonight, in whatever room you're in, listening to this story. Maybe it's late. Maybe the house is quiet. Maybe you're comfortable and warm and the world outside feels very far away. If you flushed a toilet today, if you turned on a tap and clean water came out, you are the direct beneficiary of a chain of decisions and sacrifices and arguments and engineering that stretches back through history further than you can easily imagine. You are the beneficiary of Richard the Raker, who climbed into cesspits in medieval London so that the streets would be survivable. You are the beneficiary of John Snow, who walked Soho streets in August of 1854 with a notebook, mapping deaths, being ignored, and continuing anyway. You are the beneficiary of Joseph Basil Jett, who doubled the diameter of the pipes because there's always the unforeseen, who checked every connection personally, who wrote approved, and I do not like 6 in used here, in Indian ink on thousands of plans over 16 years, who built a monument that most people walk past without stopping. You are living on their work. And somewhere right now, there are engineers and public health workers and community organizers and government officials in cities you will never visit, trying to do the same thing, trying to build the infrastructure that will allow 3.44 billion people to one day receive the same gift that you received without knowing it. They are doing the work in the dark, like the night soil men, like the gong farmers, like every person who, ever kept a city alive by doing something necessary and invisible. This story began with a city that smelled like the end of the world. It ends with the knowledge that the work is not finished, that it never really was. That the lesson of medieval London, of every generation that faced the gap between what cities needed and what they had, is not a lesson that ends when the sewers are built. It is a lesson about the ongoing, unglamorous, essential work of maintaining and expanding the systems that make civilized life possible. The work that belongs to engineers and scientists and city planners and policymakers, but also, just a little, to the people who understand enough of this story to take it seriously, to the people who refuse to be invisible to the suffering that infrastructure is supposed to prevent, to the people who keep asking, in whatever context and with whatever tools they have, has the smell reached the committee rooms yet? And if the answer is no, who can bring it there? Thank you for spending this time with this story. It was, I hope, worth losing a little sleep over. Sleep well.